There are moments in history that don't add up. Moments where the evidence exists, the witnesses are real, and yet no explanation ever quite fits. These aren't stories passed down and exaggerated. They're documented, investigated, and still unresolved. Tonight, we step past the comfortable edge of what's known. Over the next 3 hours, we'll walk through the evidence, examine the theories, and sit with the discomfort of not knowing. Because some questions were never designed to be answered, only asked. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. The clay is small enough to fit in a human palm. Its wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft earth nearly 4,500 years ago and hardened by fire or time. It sits today in a museum case, cataloged, translated, debated, and still, in many ways, unexplained. This is the inscription of Lugal-Anne-Mundu, a king said to have ruled the city of Adab in ancient Sumer, in what is now southern Iraq. According to the text, his authority stretched from the Mediterranean to the mountains of Iran, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf, an empire, if the claim is true, that would predate Sargon of Akkad, long credited as history's first empire builder by more than a century. The problem is simple. Almost nothing else confirms it. The inscription itself is a later copy, composed generations after Lugal-Anne-Mundu supposedly lived, discovered at Nippur, and pieced together from fragments. Historians immediately faced a familiar dilemma. Was this a genuine record of a forgotten king, transmitted faithfully across centuries of scribal tradition? Or was it something closer to myth, a story reshaped with each retelling, its borders inflated, its power exaggerated, until the man and the legend became impossible to separate? Mainstream Assyriology treats Lugal-Anne-Mundu cautiously. Some scholars accept that a king by this name likely existed and held meaningful power over the region of Sumer, even if the empire's supposed reach was later embellished by scribes eager to elevate Adab's place in history. Cities in this period frequently rewrote their own pasts, inserting ancestral kings into grander narratives to legitimize present rulers. Under this reading, the inscription isn't a lie so much as propaganda, a common practice, not a mystery. But other details resist easy dismissal. The text describes a coalition of 13 rebel rulers rising against Lugal-Anne-Mundu, a rebellion he apparently suppressed. It's oddly specific for pure invention. 13 named or implied adversaries, a level of granularity legends don't always bother with. And if there was a genuine Sumerian hegemon a century before Sargon, it would quietly rewrite the opening chapter of Mesopotamian political history, the very definition of when large-scale imperial rule began. Then there's the deeper problem, Adab itself. The city vanished from the historical record with surprising completeness. Once a functioning urban center with temples and administrative complexes, it fades from later king lists almost entirely, overshadowed by Uruk, Ur, and eventually Akkad. Why would a city capable of producing an empire, real or imagined, disappear so thoroughly from its neighbor's memory? Was its power genuinely that fleeting? Or was its legacy deliberately erased, absorbed, or renamed by the very cities that came to dominate the region afterward? Fringe theorists have pushed further, suggesting Lugal-Anne-Mundu's claimed borders hint at trade networks or military reach far more extensive than conventional models of early dynastic Sumer allow. Evidence, they argue, of an interconnected ancient world modern history has underestimated. Mainstream archaeology remains skeptical, noting the absence of corroborating inscriptions from the other cities Lugal-Anne-Mundu supposedly controlled. If his empire were real and vast, shouldn't someone else have written about it too? What remains is a single copied text, a king whose reign predates verified writing conventions we'd expect for such claims, and a city that slipped quietly out of history despite, if the inscription is believed, once commanding an empire of near continental scale. Perhaps Lugal-Anne-Mundu was exactly what the tablet claims, the first true emperor, later forgotten by rivals who preferred their own founding myths. Or perhaps he was a modest ruler swept into legend by scribes writing centuries after his death, filling silence with grandeur. Somewhere beneath the sands of Nippur and Adab, more fragments may still wait to be found. Until then, the question remains open. Was this the first empire in human history, or its first great exaggeration? If Adab's story is one of a kingdom half-remembered, the story of Ebla is one of a kingdom that vanished so completely, historians once doubted it existed at all, until the ground itself proved otherwise. In 1975, archaeologists excavating a mound called Tel Mardik, in what is now northern Syria, broke into a room they hadn't expected to find. It wasn't a treasury of gold or a royal tomb, it was a library, or something closer to an archive, and it would become one of the most consequential discoveries in the history of ancient studies. Inside lay thousands of clay tablets, still arranged in rows along what had once been wooden shelving, exactly as they'd been left over 300 years ago. The wood had rotted away millennia earlier, the shelves had collapsed, but the tablets had fallen in place, layer upon layer, preserving something rare in archaeology, not just information, but order. A snapshot of a filing system frozen in the instant of destruction. This was the Royal Archive of Ebla, a city that, before 1975, barely registered in the historical record. A few scattered references in Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts hinted that a place called Ebla existed and traded with its neighbors, but no one knew it had been a major power. The tablets changed that overnight. Here was evidence of a sophisticated bureaucratic state with administrative records, international treaties, trade accounts, and diplomatic correspondence, written in a previously unknown Semitic language now called Eblate. Ebla, it turned out, had been a political and economic force rivaling the great cities of Mesopotamia, with trade networks reaching from the Mediterranean coast to the highlands of Iran. And then, according to the archaeological layer sealing that very room, it burned. The fire that destroyed Ebla's palace is, in a strange way, the reason the archive survived. Clay tablets, when exposed to intense heat, don't disintegrate. They harden, essentially becoming baked pottery. The same catastrophe that ended Ebla's political life preserved its written memory in near-perfect condition. Archaeologists can pinpoint the destruction to roughly 2300 BC, and many attribute it to Sargon of Akkad or his grandson Naram-Sin, both of whom left inscriptions boasting of conquering Ebla. On the surface, this looks like a mystery already solved. A rival empire expanded, a city resisted or refused tribute, and it paid the price. Conquest followed by fire. A story as old as civilization itself. But look closer, and the certainty starts to erode. The Akkadian inscriptions claiming credit for Ebla's destruction are victory texts, the kind of politically motivated proclamations rulers across history have used to claim credit for events they didn't necessarily cause, or to exaggerate ones they did. Archaeologists have found no definitive layer of Akkadian material culture at the site immediately following the destruction. No clear garrison, no obvious occupation by conquering forces. If Sargon or Naram-Sin truly leveled the city, where is the physical evidence of their presence afterward? Some scholars have proposed alternative explanations: an internal power struggle, a rebellion by vassal cities, or conflict with another regional rival entirely, a competing power sometimes identified with Mari, a city with its own long, tangled rivalry with Ebla over trade routes and territory. The truth is, the archive that told us so much about Ebla's life says remarkably little about its death. Then there is the matter of what the tablets don't tell us. Royal archives of this scale typically served ongoing administrative needs, tracking grain distribution, recording diplomatic gifts, cataloging textiles sent to allied courts. The Ebla archive breaks off, mid-function, as though the bureaucracy simply stopped in the middle of an ordinary working day. There's no final entry bracing for war, no evidence of evacuation, no last diplomatic plea sent to a neighboring power for help. Whatever happened, it seems to have happened fast enough that no one thought to remove the tablets, or perhaps fast enough that no one had the chance. Was the destruction sudden and unexpected, catching the palace administration completely unprepared? Or does the absence of any warning simply reflect the nature of bureaucratic record-keeping, which rarely pauses to document its own downfall? There's also the matter of scale. Only a portion of Ebla's archive complex has been fully studied and published. New readings and reinterpretations of the tablets continued decades after their discovery. Some fringe theories have suggested that Ebla's trade network and the political relationships recorded in its tablets imply a web of contact and influence across the ancient Near East considerably more complex than conventional timelines allow. Connections that, if fully mapped, could challenge assumptions about which cities held real power in the 3rd millennium BC. Mainstream historians remain cautious about such claims, noting that Ebla's importance, while significant, fits within an already evolving picture of a densely interconnected Bronze Age world, not a hidden network waiting to overturn it. Still, the tablets are dense, and translation of Eblate remains an ongoing, imperfect science. How much of the archive's full meaning has actually been extracted, and how much still lies buried in half-understood cuneiform, waiting for the right scholar or the right discovery elsewhere to make sense of it? What we're left with is a city whose voice was preserved by the very fire that silenced it. Ebla's tablets tell us how its people lived, traded, negotiated, and governed, right up until the moment they don't. The final page, so to speak, is missing, burned away, or perhaps never written at all. Was Ebla destroyed by the ambitions of a rising Akkadian empire, as the victors claimed? Or did its end come from somewhere closer to home, a rival or rebellion the winners had no interest in recording? The archive that answered so many questions about a forgotten civilization leaves its own final chapter unwritten. Somewhere in those tablets, still being read and reread after 50 years, the answer may already be sitting in plain sight, waiting for someone to recognize it. There is a fragment of stone, no larger than a dinner plate, housed today among the ruins of Nasiriyah in southern Iraq, that lists 13 kings bound together in rebellion. Not 13 cities under one ruler, as with Lugal-Anne-Mundu's disputed empire, but 13 separate rulers, united, however briefly, against a single common threat. The stone doesn't name that threat outright in every surviving fragment, but historians have long suspected it points toward the same force that would soon dominate Sumer entirely, the rising power of Akkad. To understand why this coalition matters, you have to understand what Akkad represented. Around 2334 BC, a man named Sargon rose from obscurity. The texts claim he began as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, to found what many historians consider history's first verified empire. Under Sargon and his successors, independent Sumerian city-states that had spent centuries competing, trading, and occasionally warring with one another as equals were folded, one by one, into a single centralized system. It was a fundamental rupture in how Mesopotamian civilization organized itself. And ruptures like that rarely happen without resistance. This is where the fragmentary record becomes frustrating and fascinating. Multiple inscriptions attributed to Sargon and his grandson Naram-Sin boast of suppressing rebellions, sometimes describing coalitions of enemy kings rising in unified defiance. One inscription describes a revolt encompassing much of Sumer and Akkad simultaneously, forcing Naram-Sin to fight 9 battles in a single year to hold his empire together. 9 battles in 1 year. That's not the language of a minor skirmish or a single disgruntled city refusing tribute. That's the language of a coordinated, large-scale uprising. One significant enough that generations later, scribes were still copying accounts of it as instructive literature for future kings. But who organized it? That's where the trail runs cold. Mainstream historians generally treat these rebellions as understandable, almost predictable outcomes of imperial overreach, the natural friction of independent city-states, each with its own gods, dynasties, and centuries of civic pride, chafing under a newly imposed central authority. Under this reading, there's no need for a hidden mastermind or a secret alliance. Conquered peoples resist conquest, and Akkad's own inscriptions, however boastful, are simply recording that resistance honestly, or perhaps exaggerating it slightly to make Naram-Sin's eventual victories look more impressive. And yet certain details resist such a tidy explanation. The coordination implied in these revolts is, by some readings, remarkably sophisticated for a scattered response of desperate cities. Multiple sites, sometimes separated by considerable distance, appear to rise in something close to unison. Was this truly a spontaneous parallel uprising, the natural result of widespread resentment finally boiling over in city after city on its own? Or does the timing suggest something closer to deliberate coordination? Messengers, agreements, perhaps even a shared leadership structure that never survived in the historical record because Akkad's scribes had every incentive to erase it. An empire that just crushed a spontaneous uprising looks strong. An empire that only barely survived a calculated, organized conspiracy against it looks vulnerable. Which story would Sargon's successors have preferred to tell? There's also the matter of what's missing entirely. If 13 kings, or anything close to that number, genuinely coordinated against Akkad, where are their own records of the alliance? Sumerian cities were prolific record keepers, as Ebla's archive alone demonstrates. Administrative tablets, diplomatic letters, trade agreements. Now, this was a literate, bureaucratic world that documented itself obsessively, and yet, virtually everything we know about this resistance comes from the victor's side of the story. The rebels, if they left their own account of the alliance, either had it destroyed, buried it somewhere still unexcavated, or simply never wrote it down at all, fighting more out of instinct and desperation than long-term strategy. Some researchers working at the fringes of accepted Assyriology have gone further, suggesting that the coalition may have extended beyond Sumer's borders entirely, drawing in allies or sympathizers from Elam to the east or from trading partners along the Mediterranean coast, forming a broader resistance network against Akkadian expansion than mainstream history currently acknowledges. This remains speculative and is not widely accepted, resting more on inference from trade patterns and scattered references than on direct textual evidence. But it raises a fair question all the same. In a world as interconnected as the tablets of Ebla have already shown us it was, is it really so implausible that resistance to Akkad crossed cultural and geographic lines we assume were fixed? What makes this mystery different from Ebla's silent archive or Lugal-Anne-Mundu's disputed empire is that here we have no shortage of evidence that something happened. 9 battles in a year is not a detail scribes invent from nothing. What we lack is the other side entirely. We know the empire that survived. We don't know the alliance that nearly stopped it. We don't know who proposed it, who held it together even briefly, or why, ultimately, it failed to hold against a centralized military machine that would go on to dominate Mesopotamia for over a century. Perhaps the alliance was exactly what Akkadian inscriptions imply: a desperate, spontaneous reaction from proud cities unwilling to accept subjugation, crushed before it could ever truly threaten the empire's survival. Or perhaps, somewhere beneath a mound not yet excavated, or within a tablet not yet translated, lies the other half of this story. A record written not by the conquerors, but by the conquered, describing a coalition far more deliberate than history has given it credit for. Until that fragment surfaces, if it ever does, we're left reading a rebellion only through the eyes of the empire that survived it, and wondering what the 13 kings might have said if anyone had thought to ask them, where Ebla left behind a vivid, if incomplete, story, and the rebellion against Akkad left behind a story with only one side speaking. The kingdom of Hamazi leaves behind something far sparser still: a name. A handful of names, actually, scattered across a few dozen cuneiform lines written by people who were not Hamazi's own citizens, describing a place most of us have never heard of, and that modern archaeology still cannot locate with certainty. Somewhere in the highlands east or northeast of Mesopotamia, the exact location remains genuinely disputed, with proposals ranging from the Zagros Mountains of western Iran to areas closer to the Diyala River. There once stood a kingdom called Hamazi. We know this not because anyone has excavated its palace, its temples, or its city walls. We know it because Hamazi's neighbors mentioned it. A diplomatic letter here, a votive inscription there, a brief entry in the Sumerian king list, that curious document blending verifiable history with kings who supposedly reigned for tens of thousands of years, which places a ruler of Hamazi named Hadanish among the successors to the throne of Kish. If the king list is to be trusted even loosely on this point, Hamazi wasn't a minor border settlement. For a time, it was significant enough to be remembered as holding something resembling supremacy over Sumer itself, one link in a chain of shifting regional dominance that the scribes tried, imperfectly, to record as an unbroken royal succession. And then, almost as quickly as it appears in the record, Hamazi fades from it. One of the clearest surviving references comes from Enmerkar, the semi-legendary king of Uruk, whose praise poems mention diplomatic contact and possibly conflict with Hamazi. Later, an inscription from the Akkadian period references a ruler of Hamazi named Hita, who appears to have entered into a treaty relationship with an Elamite king, evidence that, whatever Hamazi was, it was still functioning as an independent political entity capable of foreign diplomacy, well after Sargon's empire had begun absorbing much of Sumer. And then, silence. No further mention. No account of conquest. No inscription boasting of Hamazi's defeat, the way Akkadian rulers so proudly boasted of crushing Ebla or suppressing coalitions of rebel kings. Hamazi simply stops appearing in anyone else's records, as though the neighboring scribes who once found it worth writing about simply lost interest or lost the ability to write about it at all. This absence is, in its own way, more unsettling than a recorded destruction. Mainstream historians generally offer a grounded explanation. Hamazi was likely a regional power whose strength depended on trade routes and shifting alliances across the highlands bordering Mesopotamia. And as those routes changed, or as larger powers like Akkad and later Elam expanded and consolidated control over the region, Hamazi's relevance to its literate neighbors simply diminished. It didn't need to be conquered dramatically to disappear from the record. It only needed to stop mattering to the people who held the pens. Under this reading, Hamazi's fate isn't a mystery so much as an inevitability, one shared by countless smaller kingdoms swallowed quietly by history's larger currents, remembered only by accident, in the margins of someone else's story. But the location problem alone keeps this explanation from feeling fully settled. For a kingdom significant enough to appear in the Sumerian king list, significant enough to negotiate directly with Elam, significant enough that a major city like Uruk apparently found it worth engaging diplomatically or militarily, we should reasonably expect archaeologists to have found something resembling a capital by now. Mesopotamian archaeology has been active for over a century and a half, and yet no site has been definitively identified as the seat of Hamazi's power. Some researchers have proposed candidate locations based on geographic and textual clues, but none has achieved consensus. Is it possible Hamazi's capital lies beneath a mound not yet excavated, in a region of Iran or Iraq where political instability or simple lack of resources has limited archaeological access? Or is it possible that Hamazi, like so many highland polities on the edges of the historical record, was more of a loose confederation than a centralized city-state, leaving behind no single capital for archaeologists to find precisely because it never had one to begin with? At the further edges of speculation, some have wondered whether Hamazi's disappearance reflects something closer to deliberate erasure, a kingdom whose defeat was significant enough to be strategically omitted rather than boasted about, perhaps because it ended not in Akkadian triumph, but in some more complicated, less flattering outcome for the empires that came after it. This remains firmly in the territory of conjecture, unsupported by direct textual evidence, but the questions it raises are difficult to fully dismiss. Why would a kingdom powerful enough to feature in Sumer's own foundational king list vanish so completely, while lesser cities left behind ruins we can still walk through today? What survives of Hamazi is a name repeated in other people's letters, a king or two mentioned in passing, and a silence that has never been adequately explained. We know it existed. We know, for a time, it mattered enough to be worth writing about, worth negotiating with, perhaps even worth fearing. What we don't know is where its people built their homes, how its final days unfolded, or why the historical record simply closes the door on it without ceremony. Was Hamazi absorbed quietly into the empires that outlasted it, its identity dissolving gradually into others until there was nothing distinct left to record? Or is its capital still out there, waiting under highland soil, holding answers that could finally give this forgotten kingdom a voice in its own story? If Hamazi disappeared into silence, the kingdom of Armi disappeared into something closer to argument, a mystery not just of what happened, but of where it even happened at all. The evidence for Armi comes, once again, from Ebla's burned archive, the same tablets that first revealed the city's own forgotten prominence. Among the thousands of administrative records recovered from that collapsed shelving in 1975, Armi appears again and again, more frequently than almost any other foreign power mentioned in the entire collection. The tablets describe extensive trade in textiles and metals, diplomatic marriages, and a relationship complex enough to include both cooperation and open hostility. At times, Armi appears as a valued economic partner. At other times, the texts describe military campaigns waged against it. This wasn't a minor neighbor mentioned in passing. Whatever Armi was, it mattered enormously to Ebla. Enough that some scholars have suggested Armi may have functioned almost as an economic rival, or even a subordinate power within Ebla's own sphere of influence. And yet, despite appearing in the archive more than almost any other polity, no one has definitively found it. This is the puzzle that divides historians. Some, based on the geographic clues embedded in trade routes and travel times described in the tablets, place Armi northwest of Ebla, possibly near the Great Bend of the Euphrates in what is now southeastern Turkey, in the region around a site called Samsat, now partially submerged beneath a modern reservoir. Others argue the evidence points closer to Ebla itself, suggesting Armi may have been a nearby rival city, whose ruins have simply not yet been identified among the many unexcavated mounds of northern Syria. The disagreement isn't a minor academic footnote. It reflects a genuine gap between how frequently and how significantly Armi is discussed in the written record, and how completely its physical trace has eluded confirmation. Why does this matter so much? Because if Armi's location remains uncertain, so does its fate. We know from Ebla's own records that relations between the two cities soured at some point before Ebla's destruction. Military campaigns against Armi are documented in the same administrative tablets that tracked textile shipments and diplomatic gifts, suggesting a relationship that shifted between economic partnership and armed conflict, perhaps more than once. Some scholars have proposed that this ongoing tension between Ebla and Armi may itself have contributed to the instability that left Ebla vulnerable to the destruction it ultimately suffered, whether at the hands of Akkad, a coalition of regional rivals, or Armi itself, acting either alone or alongside other powers with their own grievances against Ebla's dominance over regional trade. Is it possible, then, that Armi wasn't merely a passive victim of the same turbulent period that ended Ebla, but an active participant in whatever brought Ebla's palace to ruin? The tablets, frustratingly, stop before they can answer that question. Ebla's archive, as we've already seen, ends mid-function. Its final chapter burned away along with the shelving that once organized it. Whatever role Armi played in Ebla's last days, if any, was either never recorded or was recorded in tablets not yet recovered, or recovered but not yet fully translated. Decades after their discovery, portions of the Ebla archive remain under study, and new readings continue to refine and sometimes upend earlier interpretations. Mainstream historians tend to treat Armi's disappearance from the broader historical record as unsurprising, even expected. Regional powers throughout the early Bronze Age rose and fell according to trade relationships and shifting alliances, and a city closely tied to Ebla's economic fortunes could easily have suffered a similar decline once the wider trade networks of the region were disrupted, regardless of the exact politics involved. Under this reading, Armi's fate is bound tightly to Ebla's own, and the reason we know so little about its end is simply that it shared, directly or indirectly, in whatever catastrophe overtook its more thoroughly documented neighbor. But the location problem keeps this from feeling entirely resolved. If Armi genuinely lay along important trade routes near the Euphrates, in a region continuously inhabited and repeatedly excavated across more than a century of archaeological work in Turkey and Syria, why hasn't a site been conclusively matched to it? Some researchers have proposed candidate mounds, only to find the material evidence insufficient or contradicted by other geographic clues within the Ebla texts themselves. Every proposal solves some of the puzzle while leaving other pieces unaccounted for. It's a frustrating position for archaeology to occupy. A kingdom this consistently documented, this economically significant, and yet still essentially without an address. At the edges of scholarly speculation, some have wondered whether Armi's elusiveness reflects something beyond simple archaeological bad luck, questioning whether the fragmented, sometimes contradictory nature of the references to Armi across different tablets might indicate the name was used more broadly than we assume, perhaps referring at different times to a single city, a wider region, or even a loose network of allied settlements rather than one fixed capital. This remains speculative, resting on the genuine ambiguity within the texts rather than direct evidence, but it underscores just how much of what we know about Armi comes filtered entirely through Ebla's perspective, written by scribes recording a relationship from only one side of it. What remains, then, is a kingdom hiding in plain sight within one of archaeology's most celebrated discoveries, mentioned more often than nearly any other foreign power in Ebla's entire archive, and still, after 50 years of study, without a confirmed home on the map. Was Armi swallowed by the same catastrophe that ended Ebla, its own ruins waiting undiscovered somewhere along the Euphrates or closer to Ebla's own borders? Or does the very difficulty of pinning it down suggest we've been asking the wrong question all along, searching for a single lost city where the tablets may have been describing something far less fixed and far harder to find than a kingdom with walls and a name on a map? High in the Zagros Mountains, at a site called Susa, archaeologists uncovered a curious artifact. A set of inscriptions written in a script no one had seen before, later dubbed Linear Elamite, still only partially deciphered even today. Some of these inscriptions bear the name of a king who, for a brief and remarkable moment, accomplished something almost no one before him had managed. His name was Puzur-Inshushinak, and he very nearly stopped the Akkadian Empire in its tracks. By the time Puzur-Inshushinak rose to power in Susa, likely around 2100 BC, Akkad's grip on Mesopotamia had already begun to weaken. Naram-Sin and his successors had spent decades fighting to hold together an empire stitched from conquered city-states and internal pressures, possibly compounded by climate stress and administrative strain, were pulling at the seams. Into this instability stepped Puzur-Inshushinak, ruler of Elam, who did something historians still find remarkable. Rather than simply defending his own territory, he pushed outward, claiming victories deep into Mesopotamia itself, including, according to his own inscriptions, conquest as far as the region around Akkad's own heartland. For a brief window, a king from the eastern highlands, a region Mesopotamian city-states had long treated as peripheral, stood as one of the most powerful rulers in the entire ancient Near East. And then, almost as suddenly as he appears in the record, he vanishes from it. Puzur-Inshushinak's inscriptions stop. No death is recorded. No succession is documented. No neighboring power boasts of defeating him, the way Akkadian kings so proudly boasted of crushing Ebla or suppressing coalitions of rebel cities. He simply stops appearing, and shortly afterward, so does any clear evidence of the kingdom he built. Within a generation, Susa and the broader Elamite region fall under the control of the third dynasty of Ur, the Mesopotamian power that rose from Akkad's collapse to reassert dominance over the region. The question that has puzzled historians for decades is straightforward to ask and remarkably difficult to answer: what happened in between? Mainstream historians generally offer a plausible, if incomplete, explanation. Puzur-Inshushinak's kingdom, built rapidly through military conquest, may simply have lacked the administrative infrastructure to sustain itself once Mesopotamian powers regrouped. Rapid expansion and rapid collapse often traveled together in the ancient world. An empire built primarily on the personal military success of one ruler frequently unravels quickly once that ruler is gone, whether through death, defeat, or simple loss of authority over an overstretched territory. Under this reading, Puzur-Inshushinak's disappearance from the record isn't a mystery requiring a dramatic explanation. It's the predictable outcome of a kingdom that expanded faster than it could consolidate, leaving no strong successor capable of holding what he'd built. But this explanation leaves real gaps. For one, we don't actually know how Puzur-Inshushinak's reign ended. Did he die of natural causes, leaving a power vacuum that rival claimants fought over, with no victor decisive enough to leave a lasting record? Was he overthrown from within Elam itself, perhaps by nobles uneasy about the costs of constant military campaigns far from home? Or did Mesopotamian forces, reorganizing under the early Third Dynasty of Ur, defeat him in a conflict significant enough to end his rule, but somehow insignificant enough that no triumphant inscription survives to describe it. Each scenario is plausible, none is confirmed. And the silence itself is unusual, given how thoroughly rulers of this period tended to document their victories, even minor ones. There's also the deeper puzzle of linear Elamite itself. The script used in Puzur-Inshushinak's own inscriptions remains only partially understood, meaning some of what he recorded about his own reign, including potentially details about his successors or the political structure he left behind, may simply be sitting untranslated or untranslatable with current scholarly tools. How much of this mystery exists not because the evidence is missing, but because we can't yet fully read the evidence we already have. It's a strange position for modern historians to occupy, holding physical inscriptions written by the man himself and still being unable to fully answer basic questions about how his story ended. At the more speculative edges of scholarship, some researchers have wondered whether the abruptness of Puzur-Inshushinak's disappearance, combined with the rapid Mesopotamian reassertion of control over Susa that followed, might indicate a more deliberate suppression of his legacy by the powers that succeeded him, an attempt to erase the memory of a highland king who had, however briefly, humbled Akkad itself. This remains unproven and rests more on the conspicuous silence of the record than on direct evidence, but the pattern is difficult to entirely dismiss. Conquerors have rewritten inconvenient histories before. Is it so implausible that the third dynasty of Ur, eager to present its own resurgence as a triumphant restoration of Mesopotamian order, had little interest in preserving detailed accounts of the Highland king who had briefly proven that order could be broken? What's left is a set of inscriptions boasting of conquest, a script still holding back some of its secrets, and a kingdom that rose high enough to threaten an empire before disappearing without a documented end. Did Puzur-Inshushinak's line simply fail to produce a successor capable of holding his gains? Or was there someone after him, a name lost to an untranslated line of linear Elamite, still waiting somewhere in the archaeological record to be read? Susa has been excavated for well over a century, yet the full story of the man who briefly humbled Akkad, and whatever came after him, remains locked partly in silence and partly in a script we're still learning to speak. A vast mound rises from the plains of northeastern Syria near the modern town of Tel Brak. Its silhouette so large and so ancient that early travelers mistook it for a natural hill rather than the accumulated ruin of a city. Beneath that mound lies what archaeologists now believe was Nagar, one of the largest and most sophisticated urban centers of 3rd millennium Mesopotamia, a city whose administrative reach once rivaled Ebla's own, and whose end is tangled in almost as much uncertainty as its rise. Excavations at Tel Brak have revealed a city of genuine scale, monumental temple complexes, evidence of specialized craft production, and an eye-shaped figurine tradition so distinctive that thousands of small carved idols, their exaggerated eyes staring outward, have been recovered from a single temple alone, a religious practice whose precise meaning still isn't fully understood. Ebla's own archive corroborates Nagar's importance, listing it among the significant powers with which Ebla maintained diplomatic and commercial ties. For a period spanning several centuries, Nagar functioned as a major hub along trade routes connecting Mesopotamia to Anatolia, controlling access to valuable resources including metals moving south from the mountains and agricultural surplus from the surrounding plains. Then, sometime in the Akkadian period, the archaeological record at Tel Brak shifts dramatically. Excavators have identified what appears to be a large administrative building constructed during Akkadian control of the site, suggesting that Naram-Sin or his predecessors incorporated Nagar directly into the imperial system. perhaps using it as a regional governing center for Akkadian interests in the north. This much fits comfortably within the mainstream narrative of the period. As with so many independent Sumerian and Syrian city-states, Nagar's autonomy was gradually absorbed into Akkad's expanding administrative machine, its local rulers replaced or subordinated by governors answering to the empire. Under this reading, Nagar's story mirrors countless others from the era, a familiar pattern of imperial consolidation overtaking regional independence. But what happened after Akkad's own collapse is far less clear, and this is where the mystery deepens. Following the disintegration of the Akkadian Empire toward the end of the 3rd millennium BC, many Mesopotamian cities experienced a period of fragmentation, followed eventually by reorganization under new regional powers, most notably the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Yet Nagar's trajectory during this period doesn't follow the pattern seen elsewhere. Rather than re-emerging as an independent power or a significant regional player, as cities like Mari or Ashur eventually did, the archaeological evidence suggests a marked decline in the settlement's scale and sophistication. The monumental structures that once defined the city appear to fall into disuse. Population density at the site seems to contract. A city that had spent centuries as one of the most important urban centers north of Mesopotamia proper seems to simply diminish, without any clear single event marking its downfall. Why would a city this significant, with this much accumulated infrastructure and trade influence, fail to recover the way its neighbors did? Some archaeologists point to broader environmental pressures affecting the wider region at the end of the 3rd millennium, most notably a documented period of aridification, sometimes referred to as the 4.2 kiloyear event, which appears to have disrupted agricultural systems and settlement patterns across a wide swath of the ancient Near East, from Mesopotamia through to the Indus Valley. Under this explanation, Nagar's decline wasn't a mystery requiring political intrigue at all, but rather a casualty of climate stress that hit hard precisely at the moment the city needed stable conditions to recover from Akkadian-era disruption. Trade routes dependent on agricultural surplus and predictable rainfall would have been especially vulnerable, and a city whose power depended heavily on controlling those routes would have felt the pressure more acutely than smaller, more self-sufficient settlements nearby. This explanation is compelling and increasingly well supported by paleoclimate data recovered from the region. But it doesn't fully account for the unevenness of the decline. If climate stress alone explains Nagar's fall, why did some neighboring settlements weather the same conditions with far less apparent disruption? Why did cities elsewhere in Mesopotamia manage meaningful recoveries under the 3rd dynasty of Ur, while Nagar's monumental core seems to have been effectively abandoned rather than rebuilt? Environmental pressure may have been a significant factor, but the specific pattern of Nagar's decline suggests something more complicated than climate alone, perhaps compounded by political fragmentation, loss of trade partners, or internal instability that current evidence hasn't yet fully clarified. At the edges of scholarly speculation, some researchers have wondered whether Nagar's decline reflects a deliberate redirection of trade and political attention away from the city by the powers that followed Akkad, whether by the 3rd dynasty of Ur or by regional rivals eager to see a once dominant hub diminished permanently rather than allowed to recover its former influence. This remains largely conjectural, built more on the puzzling unevenness of the decline than on direct textual evidence describing such a strategy. But the underlying question persists. Was Nagar simply unlucky, caught at the wrong moment by forces beyond anyone's control? Or did its fall involve choices made by people whose names and motives have not survived in any record we've yet uncovered? What remains beneath that great mound at Tel Brek is a city that once commanded trade routes, filled temples with thousands of watching eyes carved in stone, and stood among the most significant powers of its age, only to fade so quietly from prominence that no single moment marks its end. Was Nagar's decline, written in the soil and climate of a changing region, an ordinary casualty of forces no ancient king could have controlled? Or is there still, somewhere within that vast unexcavated mound, evidence of a more deliberate unraveling, waiting for the right trench, in the right season, to finally bring it into the light? In a museum storeroom in Baghdad sits a broken stone tablet known to scholars simply as the Awan Kish Treaty, its surface inscribed with what may be the oldest recorded peace agreement between two sovereign states in human history. The text is fragmentary, its opening lines lost, its full terms only partially reconstructible. But enough survives to confirm that two powers, Awan and Kish, once negotiated as equals, sealing an agreement whose details still puzzle the historians trying to piece it back together. Awan sits at the very root of what we understand about early Elamite civilization, a kingdom that predates even Puzur-Inshushinak's brief and dramatic rise by many centuries. According to Elamite king lists compiled long after the fact, primarily reconstructed from later Mesopotamian sources rather than from Awan's own uninterrupted records, a succession of kings ruled from Awan for a substantial stretch of the early 3rd millennium BC, positioning it among the very earliest organized states in the region east of Mesopotamia. And yet, almost everything we know about Awan comes secondhand, filtered through the records of neighbors and rivals who had their own reasons for mentioning it. This is the fundamental problem facing anyone who studies Awan. We know it mattered enormously, and we know almost nothing about it directly. We don't know with any real confidence where Awan's capital stood. Proposed locations range across the southwestern Iranian plateau, with some scholars favoring areas near modern Desfo or further into the highlands. But no site has been excavated and confirmed as Awan itself the way Susa has been confirmed as an Elamite center. This creates an unusual situation in Mesopotamian archaeology. A kingdom significant enough to negotiate treaties with Kish, one of Sumer's most storied cities, significant enough to be woven into the very structure of the Sumerian king list as a ruling dynasty, and yet lacking a single confirmed archaeological home. Compare this to Ebla, whose location was uncertain until 1975, when excavation resolved the question definitively. Awan has received no equivalent breakthrough. Its physical remains, if they survive at all, are still waiting somewhere beneath the ground. The treaty with Kish only deepens the puzzle rather than resolving it. Diplomatic agreements of this sort imply substantial political maturity on both sides, a recognition of mutual sovereignty and enough military or economic parity to make negotiation preferable to conquest. This wasn't a minor highland chiefdom being humored by a Mesopotamian power. This was two established states settling terms as equals, one of the earliest such agreements ever recorded. What exactly those terms addressed, whether trade access, territorial boundaries, mutual defense, or some combination of concerns we haven't yet identified, remains frustratingly unclear given the tablet's damaged condition. Scholars continue to debate competing reconstructions of the missing sections, each interpretation shifting our understanding of just how sophisticated this early relationship between Elam and Sumer actually was. Mainstream historians generally treat Awan's obscurity as an unfortunate but explainable accident of archaeological circumstance. The Iranian plateau has, for various political and logistical reasons across the past century, received considerably less sustained excavation than Mesopotamia itself, meaning countless sites that could resolve questions about Awan and about early Elamite civilization more broadly simply haven't been thoroughly investigated yet. Under this reading, there's no deep mystery requiring an exotic explanation. Awan is missing from the archaeological record for the same mundane reason so much of ancient Iran remains understudied. Fewer digs, fewer resources, fewer decades of sustained scholarly attention compared to sites across the border in Iraq and Syria. This explanation carries real weight, but it doesn't fully account for the scale of the silence. If Awan truly held the kind of regional dominance implied by its listed dynasty and its treaty with Kish, wouldn't we expect at least some trace to have surfaced by now, even accidentally, through the extensive work already conducted at nearby Elamite sites like Susa? Excavators at Susa have uncovered layers spanning thousands of years of occupation, yet direct, unambiguous references to Awan's own capital, its palace, its material culture distinct from other Elamite centers, remain elusive. Some researchers have proposed that Awan may not have been a single fixed city at all, but rather a confederation of highland territories loosely unified under a ruling dynasty, a political structure that would naturally leave a more scattered, harder to identify archaeological footprint than a conventional walled capital. This remains a working hypothesis rather than settled fact, but it would help explain why decades of searching for the city of Awan specifically may have been looking for something that never quite existed in that form. At the more speculative fringes of scholarship, a few researchers have wondered whether Awan's near-total absence from Elam's own later tradition, overshadowed almost entirely by Susa and subsequent Elamite dynasties, hints at a deliberate historical eclipse, a later political need to center Elamite identity on Susa rather than preserve the memory of an earlier, possibly rival, seat of power. This idea remains unproven, resting on the conspicuous imbalance in later records rather than direct evidence of suppression, but it raises a fair question nonetheless. Why would a founding dynasty prominent enough to be recorded in Sumer's own king list fade so completely from Elam's later self-understanding? What survives of Awan is a name attached to a dynasty of kings whose reigns we can barely reconstruct, a treaty carved in stone that hints at diplomatic sophistication we still can't fully decode, and a capital city that has never been found. Was Awan simply an early highland power, ordinary in its rise and fall, waiting patiently under Iranian soil for archaeology to catch up to it? Or does its unusual absence, even from the traditions of its own later Elamite successors, suggest a deeper erasure, one whose reasons, like the missing lines of its own treaty, may never be fully recovered? Among the tablets recovered from Ebla's burned archive, one small category stands out for what it implies rather than what it states outright. A series of records tracking payments, gifts, and provisions made to messengers traveling between Ebla and its great rival to the east, the city of Mari. These aren't dramatic documents, they're logistics, rations issued, garments provided, silver allocated for a journey. And yet buried within this mundane bureaucratic residue lies the trace of one of the most consequential rivalries in the early Bronze Age Near East, and a handful of names that appear, deliver their purpose, and then simply stop showing up in the record entirely. Ebla and Mari spent much of the 24th century BC locked in a fluctuating relationship that swung between uneasy trade partnership and open warfare. Both cities sat astride crucial trade corridors, Ebla controlling routes toward the Mediterranean coast, Mari commanding traffic along the Euphrates toward Mesopotamia proper. Control over these routes meant control over the movement of textiles, metals, and timber, the essential currencies of Bronze Age diplomacy. Naturally, both cities needed constant communication with each other, whether to negotiate terms, manage disputes, or simply maintain the fragile peace that allowed trade to continue. That communication depended entirely on diplomats and messengers, individuals whose safe passage between two frequently hostile courts was itself a small miracle of ancient statecraft. The tablets name several of these figures. Officials tasked with carrying correspondence, negotiating terms, or accompanying diplomatic gifts between the two courts appear multiple times across different administrative records, suggesting men who made this dangerous journey more than once, trusted enough by Ebla's palace to be sent repeatedly into potentially hostile territory. And then, in several documented cases, the record simply goes quiet. A messenger who appears reliably across a run of tablets covering months or years vanishes from subsequent records without explanation, his role apparently filled by someone else, his own fate never addressed. On its own, this kind of gap wouldn't necessarily raise questions. Administrative archives are not biographies. They record transactions, not life stories, and officials disappear from bureaucratic records for all sorts of unremarkable reasons. Retirement, reassignment, death from illness or age, none of which the palace's ration-tracking scribes would have had any particular reason to document. Mainstream historians generally treat these gaps exactly this way, as an artifact of the archive's narrow administrative purpose rather than evidence of anything sinister. A messenger's disappearance from Ebla's tablets tells us only that Ebla stopped paying him, not why. But the specific context of the Ebla-Mari relationship makes at least some of these disappearances harder to dismiss so easily. We know, from the same archive, that relations between the two cities did not remain stable. Periods of apparent cooperation, evidenced by exchanged gifts and negotiated agreements, alternate with periods of documented military conflict, including campaigns that Ebla's own records describe in terms suggesting real hostility, not merely diplomatic posturing. Diplomatic missions conducted during a period of rising tension carry an obvious risk that missions conducted during peaceful trade relations do not. A messenger who vanishes from the tablets during a stretch of documented warfare between the two courts invites a more pointed question than one who disappears during a calm interlude of routine trade. Was he simply reassigned, his usual duties handed to a colleague as palace administration shifted, or did the increasingly hostile climate between Ebla and Mari claim him somewhere along the road, a casualty of a rivalry that historians can trace through trade records, but that left no formal account of the individual costs paid by the men who carried messages between two courts that increasingly wished each other harm? There's a further complication. Some of the diplomatic tablets hint at accusations of espionage, or at least at a level of mutual suspicion that went beyond ordinary diplomatic caution, with references to information being withheld, movements being restricted, or gifts serving functions closer to leverage than generosity. In an environment where messengers may have doubled as intelligence gatherers, an uncomfortably common role for diplomats throughout ancient history, disappearance takes on an additional shade of possibility. Was a missing envoy simply reassigned by Ebla's own palace, or was he detained, or worse, by a Mari administration that had grown suspicious of his true purpose? The tablets that might answer this question, if they were ever written at all, would most likely have come from Mari's own archives rather than Ebla's, and Mari's palace, unlike Ebla's, was destroyed and largely lost to history through repeated later conflicts and rebuilding, leaving us with only Ebla's side of a story that, by its very nature, required two participants to tell completely. At the more speculative edges of this puzzle, some researchers have proposed that the pattern of disappearing messengers might reflect something closer to a systematic breakdown of trust between the two courts in the years immediately preceding Ebla's destruction, envoys quietly ceasing their journeys not because of individual misfortune, but because diplomatic channels themselves were collapsing, each city retreating from communication precisely when the deteriorating regional situation made communication most necessary. This remains an inference built from absence rather than direct testimony, difficult to confirm with the fragmentary evidence currently available, but it raises an uncomfortable possibility, that the quiet vanishing of a few named men from a handful of ration tablets might be an early, easily overlooked symptom of the same breakdown that would soon leave Ebla's own palace in ashes. What remains are names on ration lists, journeys documented only by their beginnings, and a rivalry whose true costs, measured not in trade goods but in individual lives, were never fully recorded by either side. Did these messengers simply retire quietly from service, their absence from later tablets meaning nothing more than an unremarkable change in palace staffing? Or did the widening rift between Ebla and Mari swallow them along the way, their fates lost somewhere on a road between two courts that increasingly had less and less to say to each other? Somewhere, in Mari's lost archives, if any trace of them survived that city's own destruction, the other half of this story may still be waiting to be told. A mace head of polished stone, dedicated to the god Enlil at the temple complex of Nippur, carries an inscription that has quietly reshaped how historians think about power in Sumer during the 25th century BC. The dedication comes from a king named Enshakushanna, ruler of Uruk, who claims in this and other surviving inscriptions to have defeated Kish, subdued Akshak, and extended his authority over a substantial portion of Sumer, going so far as to adopt the title King of the Land, a claim to something approaching supremacy over the entire region. It's a bold assertion from a ruler most people, even those reasonably familiar with Mesopotamian history, have simply never heard of. Enshakushanna's inscriptions describe military campaigns against several of Sumer's most established powers, and unlike some of the more disputed claims surrounding figures like Lugal-Anne-Mundu, his existence and his conquests find at least partial corroboration outside his own boastful texts. He appears in later Sumerian literary tradition, and his defeat of Kish in particular seems to align with a broader pattern of shifting hegemony between Sumerian cities during this turbulent period, when dominance passed back and forth between Kish, Uruk, Ur, and other major centers in a rotating cycle of ascendance that the Sumerian king list tries, with only partial success, to organize into a tidy sequence of successive dynasties. For a time, then, Enshakushanna genuinely mattered. And then, as with so many figures from this period, the record simply stops. No inscription describes his death. No successor is clearly documented taking his place in Uruk with any continuity of authority. The Sumerian king list itself offers little help here, its entries for this period compressed and occasionally contradictory, sometimes assigning implausibly long reigns to kings we know from other sources ruled far more briefly, a reminder that the list was compiled generations later, shaped as much by later political needs as by careful historical record-keeping. Enshakushanna's name appears in it, but the details surrounding what happened after his reign, whether Uruk's dominance collapsed immediately, persisted under an unnamed successor, or fractured into competing claims among rival family members, remain genuinely unclear. This kind of gap is common enough in Sumerian history that mainstream historians generally don't treat it as inherently suspicious. Sumerian city-states operated within a political system where dominance was fluid almost by design, hegemony passing between cities as military fortunes shifted, without the kind of centralized bureaucratic continuity that later empires like Akkad would attempt to impose. A king claiming supremacy over the land in one generation could easily see that supremacy evaporate within a decade, not through some dramatic singular event, but through the ordinary churn of Sumerian power politics, where no single city held dominance for particularly long before another rose to challenge it. Under this reading, Enshakushanna's disappearance from the record isn't a mystery, demanding explanation, so much as business as usual for the period, one king's moment of glory quietly giving way to the next city's turn at the top. Yet a few specific details complicate this tidy picture. For one, the scale of Enshakushanna's claimed authority was unusually broad for the period, broader than most of his immediate predecessors or successors managed to assert. A king who claimed to have subdued multiple major rival cities and taken the title King of the Land represents, at least on paper, a significant consolidation of power, not merely a routine shift in the ordinary rotation of Sumerian hegemony. If his authority was genuinely this extensive, its apparent collapse without any clear account of how or why raises a fair question. Was Uruk's dominance under Enshakushanna less stable than his own inscriptions suggest? A claim of supremacy that outpaced the reality of his actual control? Or did something specific happen? A rebellion, a rival conspiracy, a natural death followed by succession chaos that simply never made it into the surviving record, or that existed in records since lost to time, war, or the slow decay that has claimed so much of Sumer's written history. There's also the question of what came immediately after him. Some reconstructions of the period place a ruler of Kish reasserting dominance relatively soon following Enshakushanna's reign, suggesting that whatever authority he built may have unraveled quickly, perhaps within a single generation, as Kish or another rival power moved to reclaim the position Enshakushanna had briefly seized. If this reconstruction holds, it would suggest Enshakushanna's supremacy, however genuine at its peak, may have rested on shakier foundations than his triumphant inscriptions imply, a conquest that outran the political groundwork needed to sustain it. But the chronology of this period remains genuinely contested among specialists, pieced together from fragmentary king lists and scattered inscriptions rather than a clear, continuous historical narrative, meaning even this explanation carries real uncertainty. At the more speculative fringes of the discussion, a few researchers have wondered whether Enshakushanna's reign, and its uncertain end, reflects a broader pattern across this era in which the Sumerian king list's own later compilers deliberately smoothed over periods of genuine chaos, presenting a cleaner sequence of dynastic succession than actually existed, in order to give later Sumerian and Akkadian rulers a tidier historical lineage to claim descent from. This remains a working hypothesis rather than an established conclusion, difficult to test directly against evidence this fragmentary, but it does help explain why so many figures from this period, Enshakushanna included, seem to rise dramatically into the record and then vanish from it just as abruptly, without the connecting narrative we'd expect if the full history had simply been carried forward intact. What survives of Enshakushanna is a stone mace head, a handful of confident inscriptions claiming authority over the whole of Sumer, and a silence afterward that no source has ever adequately filled. Did his brief supremacy collapse through the ordinary churn of Sumerian politics, one ambitious king's moment eventually yielding to the next, as it so often did across this turbulent era? Or does his story end somewhere we simply haven't found yet, in an inscription still buried beneath Uruk's mounds, or in a king list fragment that might finally explain what happened to the man who once called himself ruler of the entire land? A mace head unearthed at the ancient site of Girsu bears a dedication carved with careful precision, naming a king who, unlike most rulers of his era, seems to stand above the fray of Sumer's constant city-state rivalries rather than within it. The inscription honors Mesilim, king of Kish, and its tone is unusual for the period, not a boast of conquest, not a claim of subjugation, but something closer to the language of arbitration. Mesilim, it turns out, may have functioned less as a conqueror and more as a judge, called upon to settle a dispute between two rival cities rather than to defeat either of them outright. That dispute involved Lagash and Umma, two neighboring city-states locked in one of the most extensively documented border conflicts of the ancient world, a rivalry over fertile agricultural land along their shared frontier that would resurface repeatedly across generations, producing what may be humanity's earliest recorded border war. According to later inscriptions from Lagash itself, Mesilim was called upon, or perhaps positioned himself, as a neutral authority capable of settling the boundary dispute between the two cities. He is credited with establishing a boundary marker, a physical monument meant to fix the border and, presumably, end the conflict. It didn't. Generations later, Lagash and Umma were still fighting over the same land, with subsequent rulers referencing Mesilim's original boundary as a historical benchmark, a line later kings claimed the other side had violated. This alone makes Mesilim an unusual figure in early Sumerian history. Kings of this period typically appear in the record as combatants, expanding their own city's territory and prestige through military success. Mesilim appears instead as something closer to a recognized authority above the individual city-states, someone with enough standing that two rival powers would accept, or at least reference, his ruling on their behalf. Some historians have suggested this reflects a broader, though poorly understood, political structure in early Sumer, in which certain rulers, perhaps by virtue of controlling Kish, a city that seems to have held unusual prestige even beyond its immediate military power, could function as arbiters for the wider region, a role resembling something between king and referee. And yet Mesilim himself remains oddly thin in the historical record, especially given the apparent significance of his role. We have his name, preserved on a small handful of inscriptions and dedications. We have the boundary dispute he's credited with resolving. But we don't have a clear account of his own reign in Kish, no detailed record of how he came to power, how long he ruled, or how his reign ended. He appears in the Sumerian king list, but, as with so many figures from this period, the list's entries here are compressed and difficult to verify against independent evidence. Even his precise chronological placement is debated among specialists, with some scholars dating him earlier and others later within the broader early dynastic period, a disagreement significant enough that it affects how historians interpret his relationship to other major rulers of the era, including whether he predates, overlaps with, or postdates certain kings of Ur and Uruk whose own chronologies remain similarly contested. Mainstream historians generally attribute this thinness to the ordinary limitations of early dynastic record-keeping. This was a period well before the sophisticated bureaucratic archives of Ebla or the propaganda machinery of Akkad, when royal inscriptions tended to be brief, occasional, and primarily commemorative rather than comprehensive administrative records. A king remembered mainly for a single act of arbitration, however significant, might simply not have generated the same volume of self-promoting inscriptions that more militarily aggressive rulers left behind. Under this reading, Mesilim's obscurity isn't a mystery, so much as a natural consequence of when he happened to rule, caught in an earlier, sparser phase of Mesopotamian record-keeping, before the written word became the imperial tool of self-glorification it would later become under kings like Naram-Sin. But a few specific gaps resist this explanation more stubbornly. If Mesilim's authority was genuinely significant enough to arbitrate between two major rival cities, cities that continued citing his ruling for generations afterward, why does his own city of Kish preserve so little about him directly? Most of what we know about Mesilim comes not from Kish's own records, which are frustratingly sparse for this period, but from later inscriptions commissioned by rulers of Lagash, referencing him because it served their own territorial claims to do so. This creates an odd asymmetry. A king significant enough to be remembered by his neighbors for generations, yet barely documented by his own capital. Was Kish's own record of Mesilim simply lost to time and later destruction, a casualty of the same fragile survival that has erased so much of early dynastic Sumer? Or does the imbalance suggest something else? Perhaps that Mesilim's authority, however real, was always somewhat externally constructed, a reputation built more through his usefulness to other cities' later political narratives than through the kind of extensive independent power a fully sovereign king of Kish might have wielded. There's also the matter of what happened to the boundary he established. If Mesilim's ruling carried the kind of authority later inscriptions imply, why did it fail so completely to prevent the very conflict it was meant to resolve? Generations of subsequent warfare between Lagash and Umma suggest either that Mesilim's original decision was inherently unstable, favoring one side in ways that guaranteed future resentment, or that the authority he represented, whatever its source, simply didn't carry enough enforceable weight to bind rulers who came after him, once the specific political circumstances that had made his arbitration acceptable had changed or dissolved. At the more speculative edges of this discussion, a few researchers have wondered whether Mesilim represents evidence of an earlier, more centralized form of Sumerian authority than historians typically credit to this period, an early attempt at supracity governance that ultimately failed and was subsequently downplayed by later, more fiercely independent city-states unwilling to acknowledge having once accepted outside arbitration over their own affairs. This remains a minority position, resting more on the unusual tone of the surviving inscriptions than on direct corroborating evidence, and most historians remain cautious about reading too much organized structure into what may have simply been a temporary, situational arrangement between specific rulers rather than any formal system of regional governance. What survives of Mesilim is a boundary stone's legacy without the stone itself, a reputation for judgment preserved almost entirely in the words of others, and a peace that failed to outlast even a few generations. Was he a genuinely powerful arbiter, whose authority simply couldn't be sustained once the particular political balance of his moment shifted? Or does the very thinness of his own city's record hint at a role remembered more for its usefulness to later kings than for the reality of what Mesilim actually held in his own lifetime? Somewhere beneath Kish's largely unexcavated ruins, the fuller story of the king who tried, and ultimately failed, to end Sumer's oldest border war may still be waiting. Somewhere along the upper reaches of the Tigris, in a stretch of northern Mesopotamia that has never been conclusively pinpointed on a modern map, once stood a city whose name appears just often enough in the historical record to confirm its importance, and just rarely enough to leave almost everything else about it unresolved. That city was Akshak, and its story is less a mystery of dramatic destruction than a mystery of near-total omission, a city that seems to have mattered considerably more than the surviving evidence allows us to fully understand. Akshak appears in the Sumerian king list as the seat of a ruling dynasty, credited with holding hegemony over Sumer for a period during the early dynastic era, positioning it, at least according to that source, among the significant rotating powers of the age alongside Kish, Uruk, and Ur. We've already encountered Akshak once before in this exploration, as one of the cities Enshakushanna of Uruk claimed to have subdued on his way to declaring himself king of the land. That reference alone confirms Akshak was no minor settlement. A king boasting of victory typically chooses opponents worth defeating. Claiming triumph over an insignificant village wouldn't have carried the same weight in a dedication meant to impress the god Enlil and anyone who later read it. And yet, despite these confirmations of its importance, Akshak's own voice is almost entirely absent from the historical record. Unlike Ebla, which left behind a burned but extensive archive of its own administrative life, or even Mesilim's Kish, which at least survives through the words of neighboring cities citing his authority, Akshak has produced remarkably little in the way of direct inscriptions, royal dedications, or administrative tablets that unambiguously originate from the city itself. What we know about Akshak, we largely know through what other cities said about it, a pattern that by now should feel familiar, but which here reaches an unusual extreme. This is a city named in king lists as having ruled Sumer, and yet it has left behind astonishingly little proof, in its own words, of what that rule actually looked like. Adding to the difficulty is the question of location itself. Multiple candidate sites along the Tigris have been proposed over the decades, but none has achieved the kind of scholarly consensus that would let historians say, with confidence, this mound, and no other, was Akshak. Some researchers have pointed to sites near the confluence of the Tigris and the Adhaim River, based on later textual references to Akshak's position relative to other known cities. But the archaeological picture at these candidate locations remains incomplete, hampered by decades of limited excavation access and, in more recent history, regional instability that has made sustained, methodical fieldwork across parts of Iraq extremely difficult. A city credited with ruling much of Sumer for a time, and this is now the third such city we've encountered in this exploration alone, still doesn't have a confirmed physical address. Mainstream historians tend to explain Akshak's obscurity through a combination of these practical factors, the accident of which ancient sites have received thorough excavation, the destructive layering of later settlements atop earlier ones that can obscure or destroy early dynastic remains, and the simple reality that not every ancient city, however significant in its own time, was fortunate enough to leave behind a dramatic archive like Ebla's or a well-preserved monumental core like Nagar's. Under this reading, Akshak's near silence isn't a mystery in the dramatic sense. It's a gap explainable by the ordinary unevenness of archaeological luck, the same unevenness that has left us with detailed knowledge of some early dynastic cities and only fragmentary shadows of others, seemingly at random. This is a reasonable explanation, but a few specific details make Akshak's case feel like more than ordinary bad luck. For one, the timing of Akshak's supposed hegemony, as positioned in the Sumerian king list, places it in close chronological proximity to other well-documented periods of Sumerian political conflict, including the very Lagash-Umma rivalry that Mesilim once tried and failed to permanently resolve. If Akshak genuinely held meaningful power during this turbulent stretch, wouldn't we expect at least some trace of it to surface in the more extensive records left by its rival cities beyond the brief mentions we do have? The near-complete absence of Akshak from the otherwise relatively rich Lagash royal inscriptions of this period, inscriptions that were often eager to name and boast over defeated rivals, is conspicuous. Did Akshak's hegemony genuinely not intersect meaningfully with Lagash's own political concerns during this window? Or has some connecting evidence simply been lost, destroyed, or not yet excavated? There's also the question of what a city needs to sustain the kind of regional dominance the king list credits Akshak with holding. Cities that controlled Sumer during this period typically needed reliable agricultural surplus, defensible positioning, and control over trade or military routes significant enough to project power outward toward rival cities. A location along the upper Tigris would have positioned Akshak favorably for trade extending north toward Assyria and beyond, potentially explaining both its rise to prominence and, if that trade network later shifted or was disrupted, a plausible mechanism for its subsequent decline. But without a confirmed archaeological site, this remains an inference built from geography and later textual hints rather than direct material evidence, a reasonable theory still waiting for confirmation or contradiction in the ground. At the more speculative edges of the discussion, a few researchers have proposed that Akshak's dynasty, as recorded in the king list, might represent a briefer, more contested period of influence than the list's tidy sequential format suggests, perhaps reflecting a moment of genuine political fragmentation across Sumer, during which several cities held simultaneous, overlapping, and rival claims to regional authority, with the list's later compilers imposing artificial order onto what was actually a messier, more contested reality. Under this reading, Akshak's minimal footprint wouldn't indicate a city whose importance has simply been lost to time, but rather a city whose claimed hegemony was always somewhat more limited or more contested than the king list's straightforward account implies. This remains speculative, difficult to test against evidence this sparse, but it offers one possible explanation for why a city credited with ruling Sumer left behind so little proof of actually having done so. What remains of Akshak is a name recorded in a king list compiled generations after the fact, a passing mention in a rival's boastful inscription, and a location still unconfirmed after more than a century of Mesopotamian archaeology. Was Akshak a genuinely powerful city whose records simply haven't survived or haven't yet been found, buried beneath a mound somewhere along the Tigris that no excavation has properly reached? Or was its recorded dominance always thinner and more contested than the tidy sequence of the king list suggests? A city remembered more by tradition than by the substance of what it actually achieved. Until its capital is found, if it ever is, Akshak remains one of the most significant Sumerian powers we can name, and one of the least we can actually describe. In the ruins of the Ishtar temple at Mari, along the middle Euphrates, in what is now eastern Syria, archaeologists uncovered a row of statues, their eyes inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli, their hands clasped in the traditional gesture of prayer, each one carved to represent a specific individual, likely a king or high official, dedicated to the goddess on their behalf. These statues have given historians some of the clearest surviving portraits of Mari's early rulers. But for one crucial figure, the man who held power in Mari at the very moment Akkadian conquest arrived at the city's gates, the record fractures into competing names, incomplete titles, and a genuine scholarly disagreement about who exactly was ruling when Mari's independence came to an end. We've already met Mari once in this exploration. As Ebla's great rival, the two cities locked in a relationship of shifting trade and open warfare, chronicled through Ebla's own burned archive of messengers and treaties. That rivalry, like so much of the political landscape of early dynastic Syria and Mesopotamia, was eventually overtaken by a larger force. Sargon of Akkad, and later his successors, extended imperial control westward, and Mari, like Ebla before it, found its independence absorbed into the growing Akkadian system. Later inscriptions, including some attributed to Sargon himself, claim conquest reaching as far as the Mediterranean, implying Mari fell within the path of this westward expansion. But the specific circumstances of that conquest, and critically, the identity of the king who was actually ruling Mari when it happened, remain stubbornly unclear. Mari's own king list, reconstructed primarily from later references rather than a single complete surviving document, names a sequence of rulers holding the title Lugal, or king, during this early dynastic period. But the list becomes notably less certain toward its end, precisely the point that would identify who held power at the moment of Akkadian conquest. Some reconstructions propose a ruler whose name appears in fragmentary form on damaged inscriptions, difficult to read with full confidence. Other scholars, working from different fragments or different interpretations of the same damaged texts, have proposed alternative candidates entirely, sometimes disagreeing not just on the name itself, but on whether the final independent ruler held the traditional title of king at all, or whether Mari's governmental structure had already begun shifting toward a different kind of administrative arrangement, perhaps a military governor or regional official, in the immediate lead-up to its fall. This uncertainty matters more than it might initially seem. If Mari's final independent ruler was a conventional king, in the traditional dynastic sense, his fall would represent a straightforward, if significant, conquest of one sovereign city by an expanding empire, similar in essential structure to what happened at Ebla. But if the political situation in Mari had already begun changing before Akkadian forces arrived, perhaps due to internal instability, a transitional government, or even an earlier partial subjugation we don't yet have clear evidence for, then the fall of Mari becomes a more complicated event, not a clean transition from independence to empire, but something messier, potentially involving political fragmentation or internal power struggles that Akkadian conquest simply finished off rather than initiated. Mainstream historians generally lean toward the more straightforward interpretation, treating the identification gap as primarily a problem of damaged and incomplete source material rather than evidence of unusual political circumstances. Early dynastic inscriptions from this period, particularly toward the end of a dynasty facing external pressure, are exactly the kind of texts most likely to survive in fragmentary condition. Whether due to deliberate destruction during conquest, the ordinary wear of millennia, or simply because a ruler whose reign was cut short by conquest may not have commissioned the same volume of monumental inscriptions that longer reigning, more secure kings typically produced. Under this reading, the uncertainty surrounding Mari's last independent ruler reflects the unfortunate timing of his reign rather than anything unusual about his actual rule, a king caught at the wrong historical moment, his monuments and records disrupted by the very conquest that ended his authority. But a few specific complications keep this explanation from feeling entirely settled. Some later Mesopotamian traditions, including references embedded in inscriptions from subsequent periods, hint that Mari's governance in this era may have included what's sometimes described as a shakanaku, a military governor title that would become far more prominent in Mari's history after Akkadian conquest, once the city was reorganized under a new administrative system answering to the empire. The question this raises is genuinely difficult to resolve. Did the Shakanaku title only emerge after conquest as part of Akkad's new administrative structure imposed on a defeated city, exactly as most historians currently believe? Or does its appearance in some fragmentary pre-conquest references suggest something more complicated, perhaps an earlier transitional period during which Mari's traditional kingship was already being supplemented, or even partially replaced, by military governance before Akkadian forces formally absorbed the city, possibly during a period of internal crisis we don't yet fully understand? There's also the broader question of how Mari's conquest compares to what we know happened at Ebla. Ebla's destruction was catastrophic and immediate, preserved in a single dramatic layer of ash and collapsed shelving. Mari's transition into the Akkadian system appears, by contrast, less abrupt in the archaeological record, without the same clear destruction layer marking a violent, single-moment conquest. Does this suggest Mari's absorption into Akkad's empire was comparatively peaceful, perhaps negotiated or achieved through political pressure rather than outright military destruction? Or does it simply mean that whatever violence did occur left different physical traces than Ebla's fire, harder for archaeologists to identify and date with the same precision? At the more speculative edges of this discussion, a few researchers have proposed that the ambiguity surrounding Mari's final independent ruler might reflect a deliberate effort, whether by Akkadian scribes eager to minimize the legitimacy of the ruler they'd displaced, or by later Mari administrators eager to distance the newly reorganized city from an uncomfortable memory of the conquest that ended its independence, to obscure exactly who held power in those final years, and how, precisely, that power was lost. This remains conjecture, built on the pattern of the gap rather than direct evidence explaining it, and most historians remain cautious about assuming deliberate suppression where ordinary source damage offers a simpler explanation. What survives are statues with clear eyes and clasped hands, representing rulers we can often name with confidence, right up until the final chapter of Marie's independence, at which point the record blurs into competing fragments and unresolved disagreement. Was the last king of independent Mari simply an unlucky ruler whose reign and its monuments were disrupted by the arrival of an empire he couldn't withstand? Or does the confusion surrounding his identity hint at a more complicated transition, one involving internal upheaval, shifting governance, or deliberate historical obscuring that neither Mary's own damaged records nor Akkad's triumphant inscriptions have fully clarified? Somewhere in that uncertain gap between two clearly documented eras, the name of the man who watched Mari's independence end may still be waiting, half legible on a fragment not yet properly read. Buried beneath the mound of Bismaya in south-central Iraq lies a statue that puzzled the archaeologists who first excavated it in the early 20th century. A votive figure inscribed with the name Da'udu, identified in the accompanying text as King of Adab. It was, at the time of its discovery, one of the earliest royal statues ever recovered from Mesopotamia, predating many of the more famous finds that would follow at other sites. And yet, more than a century later, the dynasty this king supposedly belonged to remains one of the more poorly understood royal lineages of early dynastic Sumer, a puzzle that sits quite literally at the same site where we began this exploration. We've already encountered Adab once through the disputed inscription of Lugal-Anne-Mundu and his claimed empire stretching across much of the known world of his time. But Lugal-Anne-Mundu's inscription, copied and recopied generations after his supposed reign, represents only one fragment of a much larger, murkier question. Who actually ruled Adab, in what order, and for how long? Across the centuries, the city functioned as a significant Sumerian power. The answer, frustratingly, resists easy reconstruction. Adab's excavation history is itself part of the problem. The site was dug relatively early in the history of Mesopotamian archaeology, beginning in 1903 under archaeologist Edgar James Banks, using methods that, by later scholarly standards, left a great deal to be desired. Excavation records from this period were often incomplete, find spots poorly documented, and the careful stratigraphic layering that later archaeologists would rely on to establish clear chronological sequences was frequently disturbed or inadequately recorded. This means that many of the objects recovered from Adab, including royal statues and inscriptions that could potentially clarify the city's dynastic sequence, exist today somewhat unmoored from the precise archaeological context that would help place them confidently in time relative to one another. The result is a king list problem considerably messier than what we encountered with Mesilim's Kish, or even the disputed chronology surrounding Enshakushanna. We have several names associated with Adab's rulership across different periods, Da'udu among them, alongside Lugal-Anne-Mundu's own disputed and possibly legendary claims, and later governors who ruled Adab as a subordinate administrative center under Akkadian and subsequent Ur-III control. But the relationship between these figures, whether they represent a single continuous dynasty, several distinct and unrelated ruling families separated by periods of disruption, or some combination of local kings and externally appointed governors whose authority and legitimacy varied considerably, remains genuinely unresolved. The Sumerian king list includes an entry for Adab, but, as with so many entries from this compressed and often contradictory document, It offers a single ruler's name and a suspiciously round reign length that most historians treat with considerable skepticism, rather than as reliable history. Mainstream historians generally attribute this confusion to the combination of early, imprecise excavation and Adab's relatively modest role in the broader Mesopotamian narrative compared to more thoroughly studied centers like Ur, Uruk, or Nippur. Adab was significant, certainly significant enough to be claimed as an imperial seat by Lugal-Anne-Mundu's inscription and important enough to warrant a dedicated entry in the king list. But it never achieved the kind of sustained, centuries-long prominence that generated the deep, continuous documentation we have for Sumer's largest and most consistently powerful cities. Under this reading, the dynasty's obscurity isn't evidence of anything unusual happening at Adab specifically, just an unfortunate combination of a moderately significant city, an early and imperfect excavation, and the ordinary gaps that plague our understanding of nearly every early dynastic Sumerian center to varying degrees. This explanation carries genuine weight, but certain details complicate it further. Adab's location itself is worth considering. The city sat at a strategically important point along ancient waterways connecting the Sumerian heartland with regions to the north and east, a position that should, in theory, have made it a consistently significant trade hub rather than a marginal player. If Adab's political importance genuinely fluctuated as dramatically as the patchy evidence suggests, sometimes claimed as an imperial capital, sometimes reduced to a subordinate administrative center under later empires, what caused those fluctuations? Was Adab's power always more limited than Lugal-Anne-Mundu's grand inscription implied? A moderate regional city whose scribes occasionally indulged in more ambitious claims than the city's actual influence supported? Or did Adab experience genuine cycles of independence and subjugation, more dramatic than most of its neighbors, its fortunes rising and falling more sharply as competing powers around it, from Kish to Akkad to Ur, repeatedly found reasons to contest control over its strategically useful position? There's also the matter of what might still be sitting, unread or unpublished, among the objects Banks originally recovered. Early 20th century excavations frequently produced more material than could be immediately studied, catalogued, and published, and museum collections around the world still hold quantities of cuneiform tablets and inscribed objects from sites like Adab that have never received full scholarly treatment. How much of Adab's dynastic confusion exists not because the evidence was destroyed or never existed, but because it remains, more than a century later, sitting untranslated or unstudied in a museum drawer somewhere, its potential to clarify the city's royal sequence simply waiting for a researcher with the time and specialization to properly examine it. At the more speculative edges of this discussion, a few researchers, building on the same uncertainty that surrounds Lugal-Anne-Mundu's claimed empire, have wondered whether Adab's dynastic confusion reflects a genuine historical anomaly, a city whose early political importance was considerably greater than its later, more modest status under Akkadian and Ur-III administration would suggest. Its grander history subsequently minimized or forgotten precisely because later Mesopotamian powers had little interest in preserving the memory of a rival capital that had once, if Lugal-Anne-Mundu's inscription holds any truth at all, claimed authority over an empire rivaling their own. This remains firmly speculative, resting more on the tantalizing ambiguity of the evidence than on any direct confirmation, and most historians continue to treat it with appropriate caution. What survives of Adab's dynasty is a small votive statue naming a king whose place in history remains uncertain, an entry in a king list most scholars regard skeptically, and the shadow of a possibly legendary emperor whose claims opened this very exploration. Was Adab simply a modest regional center, whose fluctuating fortunes were never as dramatic as its most ambitious inscription suggested? Or does the city's unusually murky dynastic record hint at a deeper history, one where a genuine early power rose, fell, and was quietly written out of the grander narratives told by the empires that eventually absorbed it? Somewhere among the artifacts still waiting in museum storage, or beneath the portions of Bismaya that early 20th century excavation never properly reached, the missing links in Adab's dynasty may yet be found, closing a loop that this exploration first opened. A clay prism, roughly the size of a large fist, sits in the collection of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, its four sides covered in tightly packed cuneiform script. Known to scholars as the Weld-Blundell prism, it is the single most complete surviving copy of the Sumerian king list, the very document that has surfaced again and again throughout this exploration, cited, disputed, and picked apart for clues about Lugal-Anne-Mundu, Mesilim, Enshakushanna, and the uncertain dynasty of Adab. But the prism holds more than confirmations and corrections of names we've already discussed. Scattered across its columns are kings mentioned nowhere else in the surviving historical record, rulers whose names exist, as far as we currently know, in this single document and nowhere else on Earth. The king list itself is a strange and revealing artifact, not because it's unreliable, but because of how it's unreliable and what that unreliability tells us. Compiled sometime around 2100 BC, likely under the third dynasty of Ur, well after most of the events it describes, the list presents Sumerian history as an elegant, unbroken succession. Kingship passing from one city to the next in an orderly sequence, as though authority over the land moved like a baton in a relay race, rather than through the messy, overlapping, frequently simultaneous rivalries this exploration has traced across nearly a dozen different cities and kingdoms. We now know, from the archaeological and inscriptional evidence that has survived independently of the list, that this tidy sequence doesn't match reality. Cities like Kish and Uruk and Ur weren't simply taking turns. They were often ruling simultaneously, contesting overlapping claims to authority in ways the list's linear structure simply erases. Within that flawed but invaluable structure, though, are names attached to no other surviving source. Some entries name kings with only the barest details, a name, a reign length, sometimes a brief epithet, and nothing more. No inscriptions bearing their names, no votive statues, no administrative tablets recording their reigns. Nothing except this single later document claiming they existed and ruled. For a modern historian, this creates an uncomfortable position. Do we take the list at face value and accept that these kings were real people who genuinely held power, simply unlucky enough to leave behind no independently verifiable trace? Or do we treat unconfirmed names with suspicion, wondering whether some of them might be scribal inventions, placeholders, or garbled transmissions of names that started out referring to someone or something else entirely? The reign lengths make this question even more complicated. Several kings in the list's earliest sections, particularly those said to have ruled before a great flood the document itself describes, are credited with impossibly long reigns, tens of thousands of years in some cases, numbers no historian treats as literal history. Once the list moves past its flood narrative into what scholars generally regard as a more historically grounded period, the reign lengths become more plausible. But even here, certain entries retain suspiciously round or symbolically significant numbers, a pattern that suggests later scribes weren't always working from precise administrative records, but were, at least occasionally, filling gaps with numbers that felt appropriate, rather than numbers they actually knew to be accurate. Mainstream historians generally approach the list's unidentified kings with measured skepticism, treating the document as a genuinely valuable but imperfect historical source, one that likely preserves real names and real approximate sequences for the periods closest to its own composition, while growing progressively less reliable and more prone to legendary embellishment the further back it reaches into Sumer's deep past. Under this reading, at least some of the unidentified kings were probably real historical figures, minor rulers whose brief reign simply never generated the kind of durable inscriptions or archives that would let modern archaeology confirm them independently. Casualties of the same uneven survival that has left us with only partial pictures of confirmed kings like Enshakushanna or the rulers of Adab. Others, particularly those attached to implausible reign lengths or clustered in the list's earliest, most legendary sections, likely represent some blend of genuine folk memory and later scribal invention. Names preserved through oral tradition long enough to be written down, but stripped of the reliable historical detail that would let us verify them. This explanation is reasonable and widely accepted, but it leaves open questions that specific cases make difficult to ignore. Consider the entries for cities we've discussed at length in this exploration, cities like Akshak or Hamazi, where independent evidence, however thin, does exist to confirm at least some of what the list claims. If the list's account of these cities aligns, even partially, with outside evidence, doesn't that lend a certain credibility to its account of other cities, ones where we currently have no independent confirmation at all? Could some of the list's completely unverified kings represent rulers of cities or dynasties that simply haven't been excavated yet? Evidence waiting beneath mounds archaeology hasn't reached, rather than scribal fiction invented to pad out a tidier narrative? The uncomfortable truth is that we currently have no reliable way to distinguish between these two possibilities for any given unconfirmed name. A king who existed but left no discoverable trace, and a king who never existed at all but was recorded as though he had, look identical from where we currently stand, a name on a prism and silence everywhere else. At the more speculative edges of scholarship, a few researchers have proposed that patterns within the list's unidentified entries, particularly clusters of names sharing similar linguistic features or appearing in association with specific, otherwise poorly attested cities, might preserve genuine fragments of regional political history from areas of Mesopotamia that have simply received far less archaeological attention than the major, well-excavated centers. Under this view, future excavation, particularly in less studied regions of Iraq and Syria, could eventually confirm currently unidentified list entries the same way Ebla's excavation in 1975 transformed a previously obscure name into a documented, thriving Bronze Age power. This remains an optimistic hypothesis rather than a settled conclusion, and most historians remain appropriately cautious about assuming every unconfirmed name will eventually find its city. What the Weld-Blundell prism ultimately preserves is neither pure history nor pure legend, but something harder to categorize. A document assembled by scribes working with their own incomplete sources, doing their best to impose order on a past already partially lost to them, even 3,000 years closer to the events than we are today. Every king we've examined across this exploration, Lugal-Anne-Mundu, Mesilim, Enshakushanna, the rulers of Adab, appears somewhere on this prism's crowded columns, confirmed to varying degrees by evidence outside it. But dozens of other names sit alongside them, unconfirmed, unexcavated, unexplained. Were these genuine kings, waiting patiently beneath mounds not yet opened for archaeology to finally prove the ancient scribes right? Or are some of them ghosts of a different kind entirely, names invented, borrowed, or garbled by scribes trying to fill gaps in a history that was already, even then, disappearing faster than anyone could write it down? In the dry steppe of northern Syria, roughly halfway between the Euphrates and the Balik River, A massive circular mound rises from otherwise flat terrain. Its outer fortification wall still traceable as a ring, nearly 1.5 kilometers in circumference. This is Tel Chuera, and unlike many of the cities we've examined so far in this exploration, its ancient name remains genuinely unknown. Some scholars have proposed identifying it with Abarsal, a city mentioned in Ebla's own archive as a partner in one of the earliest recorded international treaties, but the connection remains unconfirmed. One more layer of uncertainty wrapped around a site that has puzzled archaeologists since German excavations began there in the 1950s. What makes Tel Chuera compelling isn't a lack of evidence, the way it was with Awan or Hamazi. It's the opposite. This is a site with substantial, well-preserved architecture, monumental temples, an elaborate water management system, and one of the clearest examples of deliberate third millennium urban planning found anywhere in northern Syria. And yet, despite all this physical evidence, the political history of the city, who ruled it, how its power rose, and precisely why it collapsed, remains almost entirely reconstructed from inference rather than from the kind of direct textual record that illuminated Ebla, or even partially illuminated Mari. The city's layout alone suggests a level of centralized authority significant enough to organize large-scale communal labor. The outer wall, the careful circular design of the settlement, and multiple temple complexes built with clear architectural sophistication all point toward a ruling structure capable of mobilizing considerable resources and manpower, likely over a sustained period rather than in a single burst of construction. This wasn't a modest agricultural village that grew organically over time. Tel Chuera, whatever its ancient name, appears to have been planned, its monumental scale and circular fortification suggesting deliberate design from a relatively early stage in its development, the kind of undertaking that typically requires strong, centralized political will to execute. And yet we don't know who held that will. No royal inscriptions naming a king or dynasty have been recovered from the site with the clarity that would let historians write even a basic king list, the way we can, however imperfectly, for Kish or Uruk or Ur. The temples at Tel Chuera have yielded votive objects and religious dedications, offering insight into the city's spiritual life and its connections to broader northern Mesopotamian and Syrian religious traditions. But they've been comparatively quiet on the specific question of political leadership. We know, from the scale of the city's public works, that someone was making significant decisions and commanding significant resources. We simply don't know their name, their title, or the nature of the authority they held. This gap becomes even more pointed when we consider the city's apparent connections to the wider political world this exploration has already traced. If Tel Chuera is indeed the Abarsal named in Ebla's archive, then this was a city significant enough to negotiate a formal treaty with one of the major powers of the age, a treaty whose terms, preserved in Ebla's tablets, describe detailed provisions for trade, extradition of fugitives, and mutual obligations between the two states. Remarkably sophisticated diplomatic language for this early period. A city capable of negotiating such an agreement as Ebla's apparent equal would need political structures robust enough to make and honor binding commitments, further supporting the archaeological impression of a strong, organized authority at the site. But the identification with Abarsal, however compelling, rests on geographic and circumstantial reasoning, rather than a definitive inscription found at Tel Chuera, itself explicitly confirming the connection. Without that confirmation, even this partial link to the broader historical narrative remains provisional, a plausible hypothesis rather than settled fact. The collapse itself presents its own layer of uncertainty. Excavations have revealed evidence that the city's monumental core was, at some point, abandoned or significantly reduced in scale, its sophisticated water management and temple complexes falling out of active use. Unlike Ebla's dramatic destruction by fire, there's no equivalent single catastrophic layer at Tel Chuera, clearly marking the end. No obvious violent conquest immediately evident in the archaeological record. This absence has left researchers considering a range of possible explanations, none definitively confirmed. Mainstream archaeologists have generally pointed toward the same broad environmental pressures that have been proposed for other sites in this region during the later 3rd millennium, including the aridification event associated with widespread settlement disruption across the ancient Near East around 2200 BC. Tel Chuera's location, in a zone of marginal rainfall even by regional standards, would have made its population especially vulnerable to any sustained reduction in precipitation. A city that had invested heavily in sophisticated water management to sustain agriculture and daily life in a naturally dry environment may have found that investment insufficient once climate conditions shifted beyond what its systems were originally designed to handle. Under this reading, Tel Chuera's political collapse wasn't primarily a story of conquest or internal rebellion, but a story of environmental limits finally overtaking an ambitious urban project that had, for a time, successfully pushed against the natural constraints of its steppe location. This explanation carries genuine scientific support, drawing on paleoclimate data that increasingly corroborates significant environmental disruption across the wider region during this period. But it doesn't fully account for every detail of what excavators have found. Some areas of the site show evidence of continued, if reduced, occupation well after the monumental core's apparent decline, suggesting the city's political collapse and its complete physical abandonment weren't necessarily the same event, or didn't happen on the same timeline. If environmental pressure alone drove people away, why would any population choose to remain at all, continuing to inhabit a landscape that had become agriculturally unsustainable? Does this continued presence suggest the population adapted to reduced circumstances rather than simply fleeing, perhaps abandoning centralized political structures and monumental construction while individual families or smaller groups continued a more modest existence at the site for generations afterward? Or does it point toward a more gradual political unraveling, distinct from any single environmental trigger, in which authority structures weakened and fragmented over an extended period, with the physical population declining only slowly as the political and economic systems that had once sustained the city's ambitious scale quietly came apart? There's also the broader regional context to consider. Tel Chuera wasn't an isolated case. It sat within a network of similarly planned, circular fortified sites scattered across the same general region of northern Syria, a phenomenon sometimes referred to by archaeologists as the Kranzhügel, or wreath mounds, due to their distinctive circular outer walls visible from above. Several of these sites appear to have experienced comparable trajectories, rising to considerable scale during the mid-3rd millennium, before declining or being abandoned by its end. This pattern of simultaneous decline across multiple related sites lends further weight to explanations involving broad regional pressures, whether environmental, economic, or political, rather than isolated local circumstances unique to any single city. But it also raises a further question this exploration hasn't yet fully answered. What relationship did these Kranzhügel sites have with one another? Were they independent rival city-states, loosely allied partners, or perhaps even satellite settlements answering to some regional authority we haven't yet identified? The similarity of their layouts suggests shared cultural and possibly political connections, but the exact nature of that relationship, cooperative, competitive, or hierarchical, remains an open question archaeologists are still working to resolve. At the more speculative edges of scholarship, a few researchers have wondered whether Tel Chuera and its related Grand Sukul sites represent evidence of an early, distinctly non-Mesopotamian model of urban political organization, one that developed its own trajectory of centralized planning and monumental construction somewhat independently of the more thoroughly studied dynastic patterns further south and east, and whose ultimate collapse might reflect the particular vulnerabilities of that distinct model, rather than simply mirroring the fates of cities like Ebla or Nagar. This remains a minority position and rests more on the site's genuinely unusual architectural character than on direct evidence describing a fundamentally different political system. But it underscores just how much about this network of steppe cities still awaits fuller understanding, decades of excavation notwithstanding. What survives at Tel Chuera is a monumental city built with clear intention and considerable authority behind it. Temples that speak to a rich religious life, and a water system that briefly conquered one of the drier landscapes in the region, all standing without a single confirmed name to attach to the rulers who made it possible. Was this Abarsal, Ebla's diplomatic equal, its treaty terms still partially preserved in another city's archive even as its own name faded from its own ruins? Was its collapse a story of environmental limits finally catching up with human ambition, or something more gradual and politically complex, unfolding across generations rather than in any single dramatic moment? The circular walls still trace their outline across the Syrian steppe, visible even now from above, a shape without a name, guarding the memory of a political story that archaeology has only begun to read. A cluster of small clay bullae, hollow clay envelopes once used to seal and authenticate shipments of goods, was recovered from the ruins of Tel Brak's outer settlement, each one bearing the impression of a different administrative seal. Individually, these objects are unremarkable, standard tools of Bronze Age commerce found across Mesopotamia and Syria. But the sheer number and variety of distinct seal impressions found at Nagar, more diverse than what's typically found at a single authority city center, has led some researchers to a compelling question. Was Nagar's trading power organized not simply as one city's centralized economy, but as something closer to a loose network of allied merchant interests, operating with a degree of independence unusual for the period? It's worth being precise about what merchant confederation means here, because this isn't a formal ancient term recovered from any inscription. No tablet has been found in which the people of Nagar or their trading partners referred to themselves this way. Rather, it's a modern interpretive framework some archaeologists and historians have proposed to describe a pattern in the material evidence, an attempt to explain why Nagar's commercial reach and administrative signatures look, in certain respects, more decentralized and more broadly distributed than what we'd expect from a conventional single-palace economy of the kind documented at Ebla or Mari. We've already established Nagar's importance in this exploration, a city whose trade influence rivaled Ebla's own, controlling access to metals moving south from Anatolia and agricultural surplus from the surrounding plains, its importance corroborated by Ebla's own archive. What that earlier examination didn't fully explore is exactly how Nagar organized this trade internally, and this is where the Confederation hypothesis becomes genuinely interesting and genuinely uncertain. Excavations at Tel Brak have revealed evidence of specialized production zones scattered across different parts of the settlement, areas apparently dedicated to particular crafts or goods, each showing signs of its own administrative record-keeping through distinct sealing practices. In a conventional centralized palace economy, we typically expect a single dominant administrative authority overseeing production and distribution, with seals reflecting royal or palace ownership rather than a scattered variety of independent commercial identities. Nagar's sealing evidence doesn't fit this pattern quite as neatly. The variety suggests, to some researchers, multiple semi-autonomous commercial entities operating within the same urban space, perhaps allied merchant families or trade guilds, each managing their own portion of the city's extensive trade network, while nonetheless functioning under some shared civic or religious authority, evidenced by the temple complexes that clearly still held central importance to the city's identity. This interpretation isn't universally accepted, and it's worth stating clearly that this remains one hypothesis among several, not an established historical fact. Other archaeologists have proposed more conventional explanations for the ceiling diversity, suggesting it may simply reflect an unusually large and complex palace bureaucracy, with multiple subdepartments each maintaining distinct sealing practices for internal accounting purposes. A pattern of administrative complexity rather than genuine political decentralization. Under this reading, Nagar wasn't organized fundamentally differently from other major trade cities of the period. It was simply large and commercially sophisticated enough to require a more elaborate internal bureaucracy than smaller centers, one that happened to leave behind more varied physical evidence without indicating any unusual distribution of actual political power. But a few specific details keep the more decentralized interpretation from being easily dismissed. For one, Nagar's trade network, as evidenced by both its own archaeological remains and by references in Ebla's archive, extended across a genuinely vast geographic range, connecting sources of metal in Anatolia with markets throughout Syria and Mesopotamia. A scale of operation that some researchers argue would have been logistically difficult to manage through a single, centralized palace authority using the administrative technology available during this period. Long-distance trade networks of this complexity, involving multiple intermediary stops, varied goods, and extended timeframes between initial shipment and final delivery, often benefit from distributed management, semi-independent agents or merchant houses handling different segments of the route, rather than a single central authority attempting to micromanage every transaction from one location. Is it plausible, then, that Nagar's commercial dominance was built specifically because it embraced this kind of distributed structure, allowing multiple merchant interests to operate somewhat independently while still contributing to the city's overall trade dominance, rather than insisting on the kind of rigid, centralized control seen at other major trade centers? There's also the question of what happened when Nagar's fortunes declined, a decline we examined earlier in connection with the broader environmental pressures affecting the region toward the end of the third millennium. If Nagar's trade power had been organized around a conventional centralized palace economy, we might expect its decline to follow a pattern similar to other single authority centers. A relatively swift unraveling, once the central administrative structure lost the resources or political stability to maintain control. But if Nagar's economy had genuinely operated through something closer to a distributed network of semi-independent merchant interests, its decline might instead have looked more gradual and uneven, different segments of the trade network potentially persisting or failing independently of one another, rather than collapsing all at once as a single unified system. The archaeological evidence for Nagar's decline, as we discussed previously, does show a somewhat gradual contraction rather than a single catastrophic event, a pattern that fits, though doesn't definitively prove, the more decentralized interpretation of how the city's commercial power had actually been organized. At the more speculative edges of this discussion, a few researchers have gone further, proposing that Nagar's apparent commercial decentralization might represent an early and unusually sophisticated example of a merchant-driven economic model largely independent of royal or religious authority, a genuine alternative to the palace-centered economic systems that dominated most of Mesopotamia and Syria during this period. Under this view, Nagar wouldn't simply have been a large trading city with a complex bureaucracy, but something closer to a genuinely distinct economic experiment, merchant families and trade networks holding real, independent political and economic power alongside, or even in tension with, the city's more conventional religious and civic institutions. This remains a distinctly minority position, difficult to substantiate given how much of Nagar's own internal political structure remains inferred rather than directly documented. And most mainstream historians continue to favor more conservative explanations rooted in administrative complexity rather than genuine political decentralization. What survives at Tel Brak is a scattering of clay ceilings, more varied and more numerous than a simple single-authority economy typically produces. Evidence of a trade network vast enough to connect Anatolian metal sources with Syrian and Mesopotamian markets, and a decline pattern that unfolded more gradually than the sudden collapses we've seen elsewhere in this exploration. Was Nagar's dominance built on a genuinely distinct model of distributed commercial power, merchant interests operating with real independence within the city's broader civic structure? Or does the variety in its administrative seals simply reflect the ordinary complexity of a large, sophisticated palace bureaucracy managing an unusually extensive trade empire? Its apparent decentralization more a matter of modern interpretation than ancient reality? Somewhere among the thousands of clay ceilings still being cataloged from Tel Brak's excavations, and in portions of the site archaeologists have yet to fully explore, the answer to how Nagar's merchants actually organized their remarkable commercial reach may still be waiting to be properly understood. At the site of Tel Asmar, northeast of Baghdad along the Diyala River, excavators working in the 1930s uncovered a small hoard of statues buried beneath the floor of a temple. Their eyes strikingly oversized, carved from gypsum and inlaid with black limestone and shell, staring upward with an intensity that has unsettled visitors ever since. These are the Tel Asmar hoard, among the most recognizable images to survive from early dynastic Mesopotamia. And yet, the ancient city where they were found, once called Eshnunna, is only one piece of a larger, more fragmented puzzle. The string of city-states that once dotted the Diyala River Valley, a region whose political history remains some of the most poorly reconstructed in the entire early Mesopotamian world. The Diyala Valley sits somewhat apart from the classic Sumerian heartland this exploration has focused on so far. Positioned along a tributary of the Tigris to the northeast of the great cities of southern Mesopotamia. Sites here, including Eshnunna, Tel Agrab, and Kafaja, developed their own distinct urban centers during the early dynastic period, each producing sophisticated temple architecture, administrative systems, and craft traditions broadly comparable in ambition to what we've seen at Kish, Uruk, or Ur. And yet these cities occupy a strange position in the historical narrative. Geographically close enough to Sumer proper to have participated in its broader cultural and religious world, evidenced by shared temple forms and artistic conventions, but politically distinct enough that their own specific ruling dynasties, and how those dynasties related to the larger Sumerian political landscape, remain considerably murkier than for cities further south. Part of the challenge is that these Diyala cities appear only sporadically, and often ambiguously, in the outside textual sources that have helped anchor our understanding of other early Mesopotamian powers. The Sumerian king list, itself compiled with the southern Mesopotamian political perspective, gives relatively little sustained attention to this region, mentioning it only glancingly, if at all, in most reconstructions. This leaves historians heavily dependent on evidence recovered directly from the Diyala sites themselves, evidence that, while archaeologically rich in terms of architecture and artifacts, has proven considerably thinner when it comes to the kind of clear royal inscriptions and administrative archives that gave us relatively solid king lists, however imperfect, for cities like Kish or Lagash. What we do have from Eshnunna and its neighboring cities suggests a political landscape of genuine complexity, multiple centers of power existing in close proximity, presumably interacting through some combination of trade, rivalry, and occasional conflict, similar in broad structure to the pattern we've seen play out repeatedly across Sumer proper. Votive inscriptions recovered from temple contexts at these sites sometimes name individual rulers or officials, offering tantalizing glimpses of a specific historical figures, a governor here, a temple official there, but rarely with enough surrounding context to reconstruct a clear, continuous sequence of who held ultimate political authority in each city, for how long, or how power passed between rulers when transitions occurred. Mainstream historians generally attribute this gap to a combination of factors similar to what we've encountered at other less thoroughly documented sites throughout this exploration. A regional, textual tradition that may simply have been less extensive or less well preserved than in the Sumerian heartland, the accident of which specific archaeological contexts happened to survive destruction and decay across 4.5 millennia, and the reality that early 20th century excavation techniques, while producing spectacular finds like the Tel Asmar hoard, weren't always focused on the kind of systematic archival recovery that later excavations at sites like Ebla would prioritize. Under this reading, the Diyala Valley's forgotten rulers aren't evidence of anything unusual happening in the region specifically, just another example of the profoundly uneven survival of evidence that has shaped and limited our understanding of nearly every corner of the early dynastic world. This explanation is reasonable, but a few specific aspects of the Diyala evidence complicate the picture further. The temple statues themselves, including the famous wide-eyed figures from Tel Asmar, raise interpretive questions that go beyond a simple absence of records. These statues were clearly created as votive offerings, dedicated by individuals to stand in perpetual prayer before the gods on their donors' behalf. Some bear brief inscriptions naming the person they represent, occasionally identifying them by title or role. But interpreting exactly what those titles meant in terms of actual political authority within the city, whether they represent kings, temple administrators, wealthy citizens, or some blend of religious and civic authority, not neatly separated the way modern categories might assume, remains genuinely debated. Did the rulers of Eshnunna and its neighboring cities hold the kind of centralized, singular kingship we associate with Kish or Uruk during this same period? Or did political authority in the Diyala Valley operate through a different structure entirely, perhaps more diffused between temple institutions and civic leadership? A genuinely different model of governance that simply doesn't map cleanly onto the more familiar southern Mesopotamian pattern of individual all-powerful kings. There's also the matter of how these Diyala cities related to one another and to the larger powers further south. Given their geographic proximity to one another, Eshnunna, Tel Agrab, and Kafajah must have interacted regularly, whether through trade, religious pilgrimage given their shared temple traditions, or political rivalry over local resources and territory. Yet the specific nature of these relationships, whether one city held periodic dominance over its neighbors, the way Kish or Uruk did over rivals further south, or whether the Diyala Valley maintained a more balanced, multipolar political structure without any single consistently dominant center, remains difficult to reconstruct from the currently available evidence, and their relationship to the major southern powers raises further questions still. Were these Diyala cities meaningfully independent political actors throughout the early dynastic period, developing along their own separate trajectory? Or did they exist within some looser sphere of southern Mesopotamian influence, culturally connected and perhaps periodically subordinate to more powerful cities like Kish, without the kind of clear conquest narrative that would have left the boastful inscriptions we've seen from other imperial episodes throughout this exploration? At the more speculative edges of scholarship, A few researchers have proposed that the Diyala Valley's distinct artistic and religious traditions, evidenced by the strikingly stylized eyes of statues like those from Tel Asmar, a design language somewhat different from equivalent votive statuary found in the Sumerian heartland, might indicate a genuinely separate cultural and political trajectory for this region, one only loosely integrated into the broader Sumerian world despite geographic proximity and clear religious parallels. Under this view, the difficulty in reconstructing a clear Diyala king list wouldn't simply reflect gaps in an otherwise similar historical record, but might instead point toward a region that organized political authority differently enough from its southern neighbors that our conventional frameworks, built primarily around evidence from Sumer proper, are poorly suited to fully capture what was actually happening here. This remains a minority position, difficult to substantiate given how much of the interpretation rests on stylistic inference rather than direct textual confirmation. And most historians continue to treat the Diyala Valley as broadly part of the same interconnected early dynastic world, simply less thoroughly documented rather than fundamentally different in its underlying political structure. What survives from the Diyala Valley is a haunting collection of wide-eyed statues, each one representing a specific person whose name we sometimes know, but whose actual political role remains frustratingly uncertain, scattered across temple foundations at Eshnunna, Tel Agrab, and Kafajah. We can trace the outlines of sophisticated urban centers, evidence of genuine political organization capable of sustaining monumental religious architecture across generations. What we cannot yet trace with any real confidence is the sequence of individuals who actually held power in these cities, how authority passed between them, or precisely how their political world related to the more thoroughly documented rivalries playing out simultaneously among Kish, Uruk, Ur, and the other southern powers this exploration has already examined. Were these forgotten rulers simply casualties of uneven archaeological luck, their records waiting in some yet unexcavated corner of the Diyala plain? Or does their obscurity reflect a genuinely different model of governance, one whose full-shape modern historians, working primarily from frameworks built around the more familiar southern Mesopotamian kingship, have yet to properly recognize? Those wide-staring eyes have watched over their temples for more than 4,000 years, silently, waiting for the rest of their story to be told. A diorite statue, its surface polished to a near-mirror sheen despite more than 4,000 years beneath the earth, depicts a seated figure with hands folded in quiet composure, a cuneiform inscription running down its skirt in tightly organized columns. This is one of nearly 24 surviving statues of Gudea, ruler of Lagash, arguably the best documented individual king from the entire early dynastic and post-Akkadian transition period. And that abundance is precisely what makes what surrounds him so strange. Gudea himself is almost over-documented by ancient standards. The dynasty he belonged to, and the kings who came immediately before and after him, are not. Lagash enters this exploration for the second time, having already appeared through the lens of Mesilim's failed attempt to arbitrate its border war with Umma generations earlier. That earlier conflict belonged to what historians call the first dynasty of Lagash, a line of rulers reasonably well documented through their own extensive inscriptions, particularly regarding the long-running dispute with Umma. But Lagash's political story doesn't end there. Following the disruption of the Akkadian Empire's collapse and the subsequent political fragmentation that affected much of Mesopotamia, a second dynasty rose at Lagash, and it's this later dynasty, Gudea's dynasty, that presents one of the more curious documentation puzzles in this entire exploration. A king surrounded by extraordinary evidence, embedded within a ruling sequence that is not. Gudea's own reign, positioned in the period following Akkad's decline, but before the third dynasty of Ur fully consolidated control over Mesopotamia, produced an unusually rich body of evidence. Beyond his famous statues, recovered largely from French excavations at the site beginning in the late 19th century, Gudea commissioned lengthy building inscriptions, most notably an extensive account of the construction of the Eninu temple dedicated to the god Ningirsu, describing the project in remarkable literary detail, including what he presents as a divine dream, instructing him to undertake the temple's rebuilding. These texts give us something genuinely rare for this period. Not just a name and a reign length, but a sense of the king's own self-presentation, his religious framework, his relationship to his city's patron deity, even something approaching his own voice, filtered, of course, through the conventions of royal inscription. And yet, for all this richness surrounding Gudea individually, the broader second dynasty of Lagash that he belonged to remains remarkably difficult to pin down as a coherent sequence. Historians generally agree Gudea didn't rule in isolation. Other names associated with this dynasty appear in scattered inscriptions and administrative references. A ruler named Ur-Baba, sometimes identified as Gudea's father-in-law or predecessor, and successors including Ur-Ningirsu and Pirigmi, who apparently followed Gudea's reign. But the precise relationships between these figures, the exact order of succession, the length of each individual reign, and even whether all commonly cited names truly belong to a single continuous dynastic line rather than representing parallel or disputed claims to authority, remain genuinely unsettled questions among specialists. This creates an unusual asymmetry. We know a tremendous amount about what Gudea believed, what he built, and how he wanted to be remembered. We know comparatively little about the political mechanics surrounding him, how he came to power, what happened to the dynasty immediately after his own reign ended, and why, despite this dynasty's evident wealth and religious significance, it appears to have been fully absorbed into the emerging Ur-3 state within a relatively short span of time. Mainstream historians generally frame this gap in terms of the specific, somewhat unusual character of Gudea's own inscriptions. His texts are overwhelmingly focused on religious and architectural achievement. The construction of Eninu occupies the bulk of his surviving literary output, rather than on the kind of political or military narrative that might clarify his relationship to contemporary rulers, his path to the throne, or the broader Mesopotamian political landscape he operated within. Under this reading, the documentation gap isn't a mystery in the dramatic sense. It's simply a reflection of what Gudea himself chose to record. He was, by the evidence available, a king who wanted to be remembered as a pious builder and faithful servant of Ningirsu, not as a conqueror or political operator, and his inscriptions reflect that self-image with remarkable consistency, even if it leaves modern historians without the kind of political detail we'd prefer. This explanation captures something real about Gudea's evident priorities, but it doesn't fully account for the silence surrounding the dynasty as a whole, beyond Gudea's individual reign. Consider the question of Lagash's actual political status during this period. Gudea ruled during a genuinely turbulent stretch of Mesopotamian history, after Akkad's centralized control had weakened considerably, but before the Third Dynasty of Ur had fully reasserted comparable authority over the region. Some historians have proposed that Gudea may have ruled a genuinely independent, or at least substantially autonomous, city-state during this interval, taking advantage of the political vacuum to pursue ambitious temple-building projects without needing to answer to any overarching imperial authority. Others have suggested Lagash may have existed in a more ambiguous, semi-subordinate relationship to emerging regional powers, perhaps including an early phase of what would become Ur's renewed dominance, a period of genuine political complexity that Gudea's own religiously focused inscriptions simply weren't designed to clarify, whether by choice or by the conventions of the genre he was writing in. If Lagash's second dynasty genuinely held meaningful independent power during this window, why does its own dynastic record remain so much thinner than Gudayah's individual religious documentation? A ruling family capable of commissioning the kind of elaborate, resource-intensive statuary and temple construction Gudayah left behind should, in principle, have generated administrative records tracking succession, taxation, and governance with a thoroughness comparable to what we've seen at Ebla or in Ur-3 administrative archives shortly thereafter. Some of this administrative material likely did exist. Whether it has simply not survived remains unexcavated at Girsu and the surrounding Lagash territory, or exists in already recovered but still understudied tablet collections scattered across various museum holdings worldwide, is a genuinely open question. There's also the matter of how quickly this dynasty's independence, if it genuinely possessed meaningful independence at all, appears to have ended. Within a relatively short span following Gudayah's reign, Lagash was absorbed into the consolidating Ur-3 state, its rulers becoming provincial governors rather than sovereign kings. Was this transition a peaceful, negotiated integration? Lagash's dynasty, recognizing the practical advantages of aligning with Ur's rising power rather than resisting an inevitable consolidation? Or did it involve more direct political pressure, or even conflict that simply left no boastful record, given that Ur-3's own inscriptions, when they address the broader unification of Mesopotamia under their authority, tend to emphasize restored order and legitimate succession, rather than dwelling on the specific mechanics of how individual regional dynasties were brought to heel? At the more speculative edges of this discussion, a few researchers have proposed that the imbalance between Gudayah's rich individual documentation and his dynasty's thin broader record might reflect a deliberate later editing of the historical narrative, once Lagash had been absorbed into Ur-3 administration, in which Gudayah's specific religious and architectural achievements were preserved and even celebrated by the new regime. Useful as they were for demonstrating continuity of proper temple worship and pious kingship, while the specifically political and dynastic aspects of Lagash's brief independent era were allowed to fade, less useful, and perhaps mildly inconvenient, for a new imperial administration eager to present its own authority as the natural, uncontested order of things. This remains speculative, difficult to confirm against evidence this selectively preserved, and most historians remain cautious about assuming deliberate suppression where the more mundane explanation of genre-specific inscription focus already accounts for much of what we observe. What survives is one of the most vivid individual portraits we have of any early dynastic or post-Akkadian Mesopotamian king, a man who tells us, in his own carefully composed words, about a dream, a temple, and a god he served with evident devotion, surrounded by a dynasty whose broader political shape remains stubbornly difficult to reconstruct. Was Gudayah's Lagash a genuinely independent power that briefly flourished in the gap between two empires, its full political story simply waiting in records not yet recovered from beneath Girsu's still partially unexcavated mounds? Or does the very selectivity of what survives, rich in religious devotion, thin in political detail, tell us something about how this dynasty's memory was shaped, deliberately or otherwise, by the empire that ultimately absorbed it? Gudayah's polished direct face, calm and composed across 4 millennia, offers no answer of its own, only the quiet, permanent patience of stone. In the Khyber River basin of northeastern Syria, a modest mound called Tel Beidar has yielded something unusual even among the many sites that this exploration has already examined. A set of administrative tablets written in a local Semitic dialect distinct from Eblate, describing a small kingdom's religious and economic life in careful bureaucratic detail, right up until the point where its temples, one after another, appear to fall silent. Excavated primarily by a joint Belgian-Syrian team beginning in the 1990s, Tel Beidar represents a smaller settlement than Ebla or Nagar, likely a regional center within the broader orbit of these larger powers rather than a major independent force in its own right. Its tablets, several hundred in number, offer a genuinely rare window into the daily administrative rhythms of a third millennium Syrian city. Grain distributions, textile production, livestock accounts, and, notably, a substantial portion devoted to tracking offerings and resources allocated to a network of local temples scattered throughout the settlement and its surrounding territory. This temple network appears to have functioned as a significant organizing institution for the city's religious and possibly economic life. Multiple sanctuaries dedicated to different deities, each apparently receiving regular allocations tracked with the same careful, bureaucratic precision applied to grain and textiles. And then, within the archive's own internal chronology, spanning what appears to be a relatively compressed period of active record-keeping, the pattern shifts. References to several of these temples grow increasingly sparse before stopping altogether, while administrative attention seems to consolidate around a smaller number of religious sites, or, in some interpretations, around civic and economic concerns with comparatively less emphasis on the temple network that earlier tablets treated as a matter of routine, ongoing importance. This is, admittedly, a subtler mystery than some we've explored. No dramatic conquest, no burned palace, no vanished capital city still eluding discovery. Tel Beidar itself continued to be occupied. The site wasn't abandoned outright, at least not immediately following whatever caused this shift in the temple records. But the specific pattern, a religious network that appears well established and actively maintained in the archive's earlier tablets, gradually receiving less administrative attention, some sanctuaries seemingly falling out of active use entirely, raises a genuinely open question about what was happening within this small city's religious and political life, during a period the tablets themselves don't fully explain. Mainstream archaeologists have proposed several plausible, non-dramatic explanations. One straightforward possibility is administrative reorganization rather than religious crisis. Perhaps the city's temple network was consolidated deliberately, resources redirected toward fewer, more centrally important sanctuaries as part of an ordinary, even beneficial, streamlining of religious administration. The kind of bureaucratic restructuring that wouldn't necessarily indicate any broader crisis at all, simply a shift in how the city's leadership chose to organize its religious institutions over time. Under this reading, the fading references to certain temples in the tablets don't represent decline or abandonment in any troubling sense, but rather a reallocation of administrative priority, the kind of routine institutional change that any functioning bureaucracy might undergo, without it signaling anything unusual happening to the city as a whole. This explanation is reasonable and fits comfortably within what we know about how ancient bureaucracies generally functioned, prioritizing efficient resource allocation and periodically adjusting administrative structures as circumstances required. But a few specific details complicate this tidy picture and keep the mystery genuinely open. For one, the timing of this shift in Tel Beidar's temple records appears to align, at least roughly, with the broader period of Akkadian expansion into the Khabur region. The same imperial pressure that we've seen reshape political structures at larger centers like Nagar, and, more dramatically, at Ebla. If Tel Beidar's temple network was indeed a smaller regional center, operating within the sphere of influence of larger powers like Nagar or Ebla, both of which experienced significant political disruption during this same general period, it's reasonable to ask whether the changes visible in Tel Beidar's own religious administration reflect that same broader regional upheaval, rather than a purely local, voluntary reorganization. Did external political pressure, whether direct Akkadian intervention or simply the broader instability rippling outward from larger regional conflicts, disrupt the resources or administrative continuity that had previously sustained this city's full temple network? Or is the timing simply coincidental, a local institutional shift that happened to occur during a period of wider regional change without being meaningfully connected to it? There's also the question of what falling silent actually meant for the temples themselves, physically rather than just administratively. Do the tablets' shifting references reflect temples that were genuinely abandoned, their physical structures falling into disuse and eventual ruin? Or do they instead reflect temples that continued functioning as religious sites but simply stopped being tracked through the specific centralized administrative system the surviving tablets document, perhaps continuing under more informal, less bureaucratically visible local management? These are meaningfully different scenarios. One suggests a genuine decline in the city's religious infrastructure, a shrinking of institutional capacity that might reflect broader economic or political stress. The other suggests something closer to administrative decentralization, religious practice continuing much as before, simply outside the specific bureaucratic apparatus that happened to generate the surviving textual record. Distinguishing between these possibilities would require archaeological evidence, direct excavation of the temple structures themselves, to determine whether they show signs of continued use, gradual abandonment, or sudden disruption. Evidence that remains incomplete given the relatively limited excavation Tel Beidar has received compared to larger, more extensively studied sites. At the more speculative edges of this discussion, a few researchers have wondered whether the pattern at Tel Beidar might reflect something closer to a genuine crisis of religious confidence or authority, questioning whether a period of political instability, whether connected to Akkadian pressure or to more localized conflict within the Kabur region, might have undermined the traditional religious institutions that had previously organized the city's spiritual life, with resources and attention shifting away from a multi-temple network toward more centralized, perhaps more explicitly political forms of authority, better suited to navigating an increasingly unstable regional environment. This remains firmly speculative, resting more on the suggestive timing and pattern within the tablets than on direct evidence of any crisis of faith or institutional breakdown. And most historians remain appropriately cautious about attributing motivations this specific to evidence this fragmentary. But the underlying question is a genuinely interesting one for a period we've seen, again and again throughout this exploration, produce political and administrative disruption across an entire region, from Ebla's burned archive to Nagar's gradual decline to Tel Chuera's still unexplained political collapse. Is it so implausible that a smaller center like Tel Beidar experienced its own, smaller-scale version of the same broader instability, visible not through dramatic destruction, but through the quieter, more easily overlooked evidence of shifting religious administration? What survives at Tel Beidar is several hundred tablets tracking the ordinary, unglamorous rhythms of Bronze Age bureaucracy, grain, textiles, livestock, and temple offerings, alongside a pattern within that same record that suggests something changed, gradually but genuinely, in how this small city organized its religious life during a period of broader regional upheaval. Was this simply routine administrative reorganization, the kind of institutional adjustment any functioning bureaucracy periodically undergoes without any deeper significance? Or does it represent a quieter, more subtle echo of the same political and environmental pressures that reshaped, disrupted, or destroyed so many of the larger powers this exploration has already traced across the wider region? Tel Beidar's temples may not have burned the way Ebla's palace did, or vanished as completely as Awan's still unlocated capital, but somewhere in the gradual fading of their administrative record lies a smaller, subtler version of the same fundamental question this entire exploration keeps returning to. How much of what shaped the ancient world's collapses and disappearances happened suddenly and dramatically? And how much happened slowly enough that no one, at the time, fully realized it was happening at all? Not far from the temple of the goddess Bo at Girsu, archaeologists recovered a cluster of administrative tablets tracking wool shipments, silver payments, and cattle purchases, all bearing the recurring phrase property of Baranamtara. It's an unusual thing to find, a private business archive belonging not to a king, but to his wife, documenting years of independent commercial activity conducted by a woman who managed her own estates, her own temple, and her own trade relationships across Sumer, right up until the point where the record simply stops, swallowed by one of the most dramatic political upheavals in early Mesopotamian history. Baranamtara was queen consort of Lagash, married to King Lugal-Anne, who came to power around 2384 BC during the later years of the first dynasty of Lagash, generations after Mesilim's failed arbitration of the city's border war with Umma, and roughly contemporary with the very Bara Irnun of Umma. This exploration nearly confused her with a coincidence of names that itself speaks to how frequently these two rival cities' royal households intersected. What makes Baranamtara remarkable isn't her marriage, but the sheer scale of independent economic activity the surviving tablets attribute to her personally. She presided over her own temple estates, dedicated to the goddess Bao, and appears to have operated what amounted to a genuine commercial enterprise, purchasing cattle from Elam, selling copper to merchants in Umma, and sending wool and silver to the distant trading hub of Dilmun in the Persian Gulf. She bought and sold slaves. She exchanged diplomatic gifts with the wife of the ruler of Adab. For a period of roughly 6 years, the tablets paint a portrait of a queen operating with real, independent economic authority, unusually well documented even by the relatively generous standards of early dynastic Lagash's administrative record-keeping. And then, Lugal-Anne was overthrown. Around 2378 BC, a ruler named Ur-Nanshe, sometimes rendered Urukagina, seized power in Lagash, and in doing so produced what many historians consider one of the earliest surviving examples of a reform-minded political manifesto. His inscriptions describe, in pointed and moralizing language, a litany of abuses committed under the preceding administration: corrupt officials extracting excessive fees, priests exploiting temple resources for personal gain, and a general pattern of powerful figures enriching themselves at the expense of ordinary citizens. Ur-Nanshe presents his own rise to power explicitly as a correction of these abuses, a restoration of just governance under the protection of the god Ningirsu. This is where Baranamtara's story becomes genuinely uncertain. If Ur-Nanshe's reforms targeted the excesses of the preceding regime, and if Baranamtara's own extensive personal wealth and independent commercial activity represented exactly the kind of concentrated private advantage his inscriptions rail against, what happened to her, specifically, when her husband's government fell? The tablets that so richly documented her business dealings during Lugal-Anne's reign simply don't continue with the same clarity into Ur-Nanshe's period. We don't have a clear record of her death, her exile, her forced retirement from public commercial life, or any negotiated arrangement that might have let her retain some portion of her considerable personal estate under the new administration. Mainstream historians generally offer a fairly grounded explanation for this gap, rooted in the ordinary mechanics of Mesopotamian political transition. When one ruling family replaced another in this period, it was common, almost expected, for administrative record-keeping to shift focus accordingly, tablets tracking the new queen's activities. If Ur-Nanshe had a wife with comparable administrative responsibilities, would naturally have replaced tablets tracking Baranamtara's, not necessarily because anything sinister happened to her personally, but simply because the palace bureaucracy's attention moved on, as bureaucracies generally do to whoever currently held the relevant position. Under this reading, Baranamtera's disappearance from the record isn't evidence of a dramatic downfall, exile, or punishment, but rather the unremarkable consequence of a change in administration, the kind of quiet fading from official documentation that likely happened to most deposed rulers' family members throughout Sumerian history, simply because new governments generate new records centered on new figures. This explanation is reasonable, but the specific content of Ur-Nanshe's own inscriptions complicates it in ways worth sitting with. His reform texts are unusually explicit, by ancient royal standards, about naming the kinds of abuses his administration claimed to be correcting. Extortionate fees charged by officials for funerary rites, priests appropriating goods meant for temple use, and administrators enriching themselves through practices Ur-Nanshe characterizes as exploitative overreach. If Baranamtara's own extensive management of temple estates and independent commercial dealings fell within the scope of what the new regime considered problematic concentration of private advantage, even if her own conduct had been entirely legitimate by the standards of her own time, it's reasonable to wonder whether she became, at least implicitly, a symbol of the very excess Ur-Nanshe was positioning himself against. Was she publicly disgraced as part of the new administration's broader narrative of moral correction? Quietly sidelined without formal punishment, her estates simply reabsorbed into more centralized administrative control? Or did she retain some meaningful status despite the political transition, her absence from the surviving tablets reflecting nothing more than the incompleteness of what has been excavated and published, rather than any genuine decline in her circumstances? There's also a question of physical fate that the tablets simply cannot answer. Political transitions in this period, even ones framed by the incoming ruler as moral restoration rather than violent conquest, weren't always peaceful for the family members of the deposed regime. We have no inscription describing what became of Lugal-Anne himself following Ur-Nanshe's rise, let alone his wife. Did the former king and queen survive the transition, perhaps living out their remaining years in reduced but intact circumstances? Or did the change in power involve consequences more severe than Ur-Nanshe's carefully worded reform texts, focused as they are on institutional abuses rather than the personal fates of specific individuals, chose to record? At the more speculative edges of this discussion, a few researchers have wondered whether Ur-Nanshe's own rise to power might have been considerably less purely reformist than his surviving inscriptions presented, suggesting the moralizing language of corrected abuses could have functioned, at least in part, as political justification for what may have been a more conventional seizure of power, one in which discrediting the wealth and independent authority of figures like Baranamtera served a useful propagandistic purpose regardless of whether her actual conduct had been genuinely exploitative or simply typical of how queens in her position had long operated. This remains an interpretive question rather than one with clear documentary resolution, and most historians remain cautious about assuming political motives beyond what the admittedly self-serving inscriptions themselves describe, especially given how common this kind of reform rhetoric would become in later Mesopotamian royal tradition. What survives of Baranamtera is an unusually rich business archive: cattle purchased from Elam, wool and silver sent to Dilmun, diplomatic gifts exchanged with a fellow queen in Adab, all attesting to a woman who wielded real, independently documented economic authority for a genuine stretch of Lagash's history. And then, precisely at the moment her husband's government fell to a rival promising moral reform, that same detailed record simply stops, leaving her ultimate fate, whether quiet retirement, public disgrace, or something more severe, entirely unrecorded. Did Baranamtera's considerable personal wealth make her, even implicitly, a target of Ur-Nanshe's reforming rhetoric, a symbol of the excess his new administration claimed to be correcting? Or did she simply fade from a bureaucratic record that had already moved its attention elsewhere, her actual circumstances afterward far less dramatic than the political transition surrounding her might suggest? Somewhere beneath Girsu's still active excavations, further tablets may yet surface to finally answer what happened to the queen, whose name once marked so much of what Lagash owned, and who then, alongside her husband's fallen government, simply stopped being written about at all. A perforated stone relief, roughly the size of a serving tray, shows a barefoot king carrying a basket of earth on his head, a ritual gesture symbolizing the founding of a temple. This is Ur-Nanshe, founder of the first dynasty of Lagash, depicted in one of the most famous images to survive from early dynastic Sumer, his name and titles carved beside him along with the names of several of his sons. The relief is confident, celebratory, a monument built by a king clearly intent on establishing his family's legacy for generations. What that legacy actually looked like in practice, however, particularly how his immediate successors met their own ends, is considerably less certain than the relief's confident imagery suggests. Ur-Nanshe himself is reasonably well documented, credited with an ambitious building program of canals and temples across Lagash, and remembered as the founder of a dynasty that would go on to produce some of the best-known rulers of the entire early dynastic period. His son and successor, Akkad, ruled only briefly, and what we know of his reign comes largely second-hand, through a later inscription commissioned by his own son describing a moment when, as the text puts it, the ruler of Umma spoke arrogantly and defied Lagash, apparently costing Akkad some portion of his territory. Beyond this fragment, Akkad's own reign, and precisely how or when it ended, is essentially a blank. No inscription in his own name records his death. No text describes whether he died of natural causes, in battle against the same Umma that had defied him, or, under some other circumstance, entirely. This pattern, a king's death simply absent from an otherwise reasonably documented record, repeats through the dynasty that followed him, and becomes genuinely puzzling once we reach the succession from Eannatum to his brother Eannatum Eannatum, Akkad's son, is one of the most extensively documented rulers of the entire early dynastic period, credited on the famous Stele of the Vultures with subduing Umma decisively, extending Lagash's authority across much of Sumer, and even campaigning against Elam. His inscriptions are triumphant, detailed, and militarily specific in a way few contemporary rulers matched. And yet, exactly like his father, no surviving text tells us how his reign ended. We know he was succeeded not by a son, but by his brother Eannatum IV, an arrangement that itself raises a fair question. Sumerian succession in this period generally, though not universally, favored direct paternal descent, a son following his father. A brother succeeding a brother wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't the default pattern either, and typically occurred under specific circumstances. The absence of a surviving son old enough or established enough to take the throne, a succession crisis following an unexpected death, or a deliberate arrangement made for reasons the surviving texts don't spell out. Mainstream historians generally treat this transition as unremarkable, given how sparse the underlying evidence is. Eannatum's reign involved sustained active warfare, campaigns against Umma, against Elam, against a wider coalition of Sumerian rivals mentioned in his inscriptions. A king this consistently engaged in military conflict faced genuinely elevated risk of dying without a mature male heir ready to immediately assume the throne, whether through death in battle, a shortened lifespan from the physical toll of near-constant campaigning, or simply the ordinary chance that his sons were still too young at the time of his death to rule effectively. Under this reading, Akhenaten's succession isn't evidence of anything unusual happening within the royal family specifically, just a reasonably common contingency arrangement. A brother stepping in to maintain dynastic continuity when the direct line wasn't immediately ready to take over. This is a sound and cautious explanation, but it doesn't fully resolve why not a single inscription from this stretch of Lagash's history, spanning at least 2, arguably 3 successive reigns, records any king's death directly. Sumerian royal inscriptions of this period were not shy about military triumphs, temple construction, or territorial disputes. The near-total silence specifically around how each ruler's reign concluded, generation after generation, stands out precisely because these same kings were otherwise so willing to document themselves in vivid, self-promoting detail. Akhenaten's own reign continued the pattern of vigorous, well-documented conflict, most notably his eventual defeat of Ur-Luma of Umma, the same Ur-Luma whose daughter, Bara-Irnun, we encountered in the previous chapter of this exploration, married into Umma's rival royal line following her father's downfall. In Akhenaten, I successfully repelled Ur-Luma's attack on Lagash after a series of battles, a genuine military achievement recorded with the same detailed pride we'd expect from a dynasty, this consistently willing to celebrate its victories. And once again, following this triumph, the specific circumstances of his own death go unrecorded, his reign simply ending, according to the sequence reconstructed by modern historians, with his son Entemena taking the throne next. Is there a meaningful pattern here? Or is this simply the ordinary silence of a period whose royal inscriptions consistently prioritized triumph over mortality, regardless of how any individual king actually died? Some historians have pointed out reasonably that ancient royal inscriptions across Mesopotamia as a whole rarely dwelt on a ruler's death in his own commissioned texts, for the straightforward reason that a king couldn't very well commission an inscription describing his own demise, and his successor's own inscriptions typically focused on establishing that successor's legitimacy and achievements rather than dwelling on exactly how the previous ruler's life had ended. Under this reading, the silence surrounding Akurgol's, Akhenaten's, and Akhenaten's deaths isn't a mystery unique to this particular dynasty at all, but simply an artifact of how royal commemorative inscriptions functioned across the entire ancient Near East, a genre built to celebrate continuity and achievement, not to document mortality. Yet the specific irregularity of Akhenaten being succeeded by his brother rather than a son remains a detail worth sitting with a little longer. Some researchers have proposed that this transition might reflect more than simple contingency, wondering whether Akhenaten's later years involved some genuine crisis, whether military, political, or personal, significant enough to disrupt normal succession expectations but never explicitly documented. Perhaps because acknowledging such a crisis directly would have undermined the image of continuous dynastic strength the family's inscriptions otherwise worked so consistently to project. This remains speculative, built more on the unusual shape of the succession than on any direct evidence describing what actually happened. And most historians remain appropriately cautious about inferring hidden turmoil from what may simply be an ordinary, if slightly atypical, contingency arrangement. What survives of this stretch of Lagash's dynasty is a sequence of vividly documented military triumphs. A founding king shown humbly carrying earth for a temple's foundation, and a conspicuous, repeated silence surrounding exactly how each of his immediate successors met to their own end. Did Akurgal, Akhenaten, and Akhenaten simply die of causes their own dynasty's inscriptions had no interest in recording? Their triumphant texts focused entirely on what they achieved in life, rather than how that life concluded. Or Does the unusual succession from Eannatum to his brother hint at something more disruptive happening within the royal family during this period? A crisis smoothed over by later inscriptions eager to present an unbroken image of dynastic strength. Somewhere in Girsu's still partially unexcavated mounds, among tablets not yet recovered or read, the missing final chapters of these kings' individual stories may yet surface, closing gaps that 4,500 years of triumphant stone carving chose, for reasons we can only speculate about, not to fill.